Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The desert night had a weight to it that Thaddeus McCrae had never quite gotten used to, even after 6 years with Border Patrol. It pressed down on everything, thick and heavy, turning the air into something you had to push through with each breath. The beam from his mag light cut a narrow path through the darkness ahead, illuminating patches of creosote bush and ocotillo, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the sand. His boots crunched over the hardpan as he made his way along the fence line, the sound abnormally loud in the stillness. He'd been partnered with Ira Pendleton for about 8 months now, and the man had a way of moving through the desert that made Thaddeus feel clumsy by comparison. Ira was somewhere off to his left, maybe 30 yards out, his own flashlight bobbing like a firefly in the blackness. They were working a grid pattern tonight, checking a stretch of fence that had seen some unusual activity over the past week. Nothing concrete, just sensor hits that didn't add up, tracks that seemed to appear and disappear without rhyme or reason. The kind of thing that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you let yourself think about it too long. "You getting anything over there?" Thaddeus called out, his voice sounding strange and flat in the open air. There was a pause, just long enough to make him wonder if Ira had heard him at all, before his partner's response crackled through the radio on his belt. "Nothing but rocks and rattlesnakes," Ira said. "This whole sector's been dead quiet all week. Makes you wonder what tripped those sensors." Thaddeus didn't have an answer for that. He'd seen plenty of false alarms in his time, animals mostly, sometimes just the wind kicking up enough dust to fool the equipment. But there was something about this particular stretch that bothered him, had been bothering him for days now. The sensors here were newer, more reliable, and they'd been going off with a regularity that suggested something more than random wildlife. 3 nights running, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always in roughly the same spot. And yet, every time they came out to investigate, there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of passage, nothing disturbed. Just empty desert and that oppressive silence. They'd been out here for maybe 40 minutes when Thaddeus spotted the first light. It was off to the southwest, maybe a quarter-mile distant, a pale flicker that reminded him of the emergency flares they sometimes saw found abandoned along the migrant trails. He stopped walking and raised his hand, signaling Ira, even though he knew his partner probably couldn't see the gesture in the dark. The light bobbed once, twice, then seemed to drift sideways, moving parallel to the border fence. It didn't behave like a flare at all. Flares burned steady and bright before guttering out. This thing pulsed, fading almost to nothing before brightening again, and it moved with a deliberate quality that made his chest tighten. "Ira, you seeing this?" He kept his voice low, though he couldn't have said why. The light was too far away for whoever was carrying it to hear him, if it was even a person at all. "Yeah, I got it." Ira's voice had changed, lost that easy drawl it usually carried. "That's not a flare." "No," Thaddeus agreed. "It's not." They watched in silence as the light continued its strange sideways drift, never getting closer, never moving away. Thaddeus pulled out his GPS unit and marked their position, then marked the approximate location of the light. The numbers didn't make sense. According to the GPS, the light was coming from a position that should have been on the Mexican side of the border, but not by much. Maybe 50 yards, maybe less. He frowned at the screen, tapped it a couple times to make sure it was working properly. The numbers shifted slightly, jumping a few meters to the east, then back again. "GPS is acting weird," he said. "You getting the same thing?" There was another pause, longer this time, before Ira responded. "Yeah, mine's jumping around like it can't decide where we are. Says we're in 3 different spots at once. That wasn't right. The units were supposed to be accurate to within a few feet. Military-grade hardware that could pinpoint your location anywhere on Earth." Thaddeus shook his unit, which he knew was pointless, but did it anyway, watching as the coordinates flickered and shifted on the display. The light in the distance had stopped moving now. It hung there in the darkness, pulsing slowly, and he got the distinct impression that it was watching them, waiting to see what they would do next. "We should check it out," Ira said, though he didn't sound enthusiastic about the prospect. Thaddeus knew he was right. It was their job to investigate anything unusual, anything that might indicate illegal crossing activity, and yet everything in him wanted to get back in the truck and drive away, file a report in the morning, and let the day shift handle it. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that it was just the darkness and the isolation playing tricks on his nerves. But that feeling wouldn't go away, that sense that they were being watched, that something out there in the desert knew they were here and was interested in them in a way that made his skin crawl. "Yeah," he said, finally. "Yeah, let's go take a look." They moved toward the light in a loose formation, staying maybe 20 feet apart, their flashlights sweeping the ground ahead. The terrain here was rough, full of small washes and clusters of cola cactus that seemed to grab at their pants as they passed. Thaddeus kept one eye on the GPS unit, watching as it continued to misbehave, the coordinates jumping and shifting with every few steps. The light ahead grew no brighter as they approached, which should have been impossible. They'd covered at least 100 yards, maybe more, and it still looked just as distant as it had when they'd first spotted it. "This doesn't make sense," Ira muttered. He'd closed the distance between them, moving closer until they were walking almost side by side. "We should be right on top of it by now." Thaddeus checked the GPS again and felt his stomach drop. According to the unit, they'd moved less than 30 feet from their original position. But he could see the fence line behind them, could see how far they'd walked. The GPS was lying, or something was making it lie. He was about to say something to Ira when his boot hit something that rattled and rolled. He stopped, swung his flashlight down, and felt his breath catch in his throat. It was a water jug, one of those 5-gallon plastic containers that migrants carried with them on the crossing. Nothing unusual about that. They found them all the time, scattered along the trails like breadcrumbs, abandoned when they got too heavy or the water ran out. But this one was different. It sat upright in the middle of a small clearing, placed there deliberately, and on its surface someone had drawn a symbol in what looked like black marker. The symbol was intricate, all curves and angles that hurt to look at, and as Thaddeus stared at it he felt a strange buzzing sensation start up behind his eyes. "The hell is that?" Ira had moved up beside him, was leaning in to get a better look at the marking. "Some kind of gang sign? I don't know." Thaddeus crouched down, careful not to touch the jug, playing his light over the symbol. It didn't look like any gang marking he'd ever seen, and he'd seen plenty. There was something organic about it, something that reminded him of the patterns you'd see in nature. Spirals and fractals that repeated at different scales. The longer he looked at it, the worse that buzzing in his head became, until he had to look away just to clear his thoughts. When he glanced up, the light in the distance was gone. The desert stretched away into darkness on all sides, empty and silent except for the faint whisper of wind over sand. He stood up quickly, scanning the horizon with his flashlight, but there was nothing to see. The light had simply vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Ira was doing the same thing, his light cutting wild arcs through the night, and Thaddeus could hear the man's breathing, quick and shallow, with something that might have been fear. "Where'd it go?" Ira's voice had gone tight. "It was right there, and now it's just gone." "I don't know." Thaddeus pulled out his radio, keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. We've got a situation out here on the Sonoran sector. Grid reference." He paused, looked down at his GPS unit, and felt that sick feeling in his stomach get worse. The screen was blank, completely dead, even though it had been working fine just a minute ago. He tried turning it off and on again, but nothing happened. The unit was bricked, useless. "Dispatch, we've lost GPS function. We're investigating an unknown light source and we found something unusual, requesting backup for our position." Static answered him, thick and heavy, punctuated by odd pops and clicks that sounded almost like speech if you listened hard enough. He tried again, got the same result, then looked over at Ira. His partner was already shaking his head. "Mine's dead too," Ira said. "Radio, GPS, everything. Even my phone." He pulled out his cell, showed Thaddeus the blank screen. "This doesn't just happen. All our equipment doesn't just die at the same time." Thaddeus knew he was right. The gear they carried was built to military specifications, designed to keep working in the harshest conditions imaginable. And yet, here they were, standing in the middle of the desert with nothing but their flashlights and their sidearms, cut off from backup and communication, with that damned water jug sitting there between them like some kind of monument. He was about to suggest they head back to the truck when he heard it, a sound that made every muscle in his body go rigid. It was whistling, low and melodic, coming from somewhere off to their right. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was out there in the darkness, whistling a tune that had no business existing in this empty place. The melody was old, something that sounded like it belonged in a church, or maybe a funeral. Slow and mournful and utterly wrong. It drifted through the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and underneath it, Thaddeus could swear he heard other sounds, faint and distant. Footsteps maybe, or something being dragged across sand. "We need to leave," Ira whispered. His hand had dropped to his sidearm, fingers drumming nervously on the grip. "Right now, Thad, we need to go." Thaddeus wanted to argue, wanted to say they should investigate, do their jobs, but that whistling was getting louder, closer, and the rational part of his brain was screaming at him to run. He nodded, and they turned as one, heading back the way they'd come, or at least the way they thought they'd come. In the darkness, with no GPS and no landmarks to guide them, the desert all looked the same. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, their flashlights cutting frantic paths through the night, and the whole time that whistling followed them, never getting closer but never fading away either. When they finally stumbled back to the fence line, Thaddeus felt a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. The truck was visible in the distance, its white paint gleaming in the starlight, and he'd never been so happy to see a government vehicle in his life. They half ran the last 100 yards, throwing themselves into the cab like they were being chased, though when Thaddeus looked back there was nothing behind them but empty desert. Ira started the engine and threw it into gear, tires spitting gravel as they pulled away from that cursed stretch of border. Neither of them spoke during the drive back to the station. What was there to say? That they'd seen a light that defied the laws of physics? That they'd found a water jug marked with a symbol that made your head hurt to look at? That something out there in the darkness had been whistling at them, playing a game they didn't understand? It all sounded insane, the kind of thing that got you pulled off patrol and sent for a psych evaluation. So they drove in silence, and when they finally pulled into the station lot, Ira killed the engine and just sat there for a long moment, staring straight ahead. "You ever hear about the old crossing routes?" he asked finally. His voice was quiet, thoughtful. The ones from way back, before the fence, before any of this modern stuff? Thaddeus shook his head. What about them? There were stories, Ira said. Things the old-timers used to talk about. Places along the border where people would disappear, where compasses wouldn't work right and you'd see lights that shouldn't be there. They called them the naked lines. Strips of desert where all the normal rules just stopped applying. He turned to look at Thaddeus, his face pale in the dashboard lights. I always thought it was just bullshit, you know? Campfire stories to scare the rookies. But after tonight, I don't know what to think. Thaddeus finished. He pulled out his GPS unit, tried turning it on again. This time it came to life. The screen flickering on to show their current position with perfect accuracy. His radio crackled to life as well, dispatch asking for a status update in a bored voice that suggested they had no idea anything unusual had happened. Everything was working again, as if the past hour had been nothing but a shared hallucination. But Thaddeus knew better. He could still hear that whistling in his head, could still see that symbol burned into the water jug. Whatever they'd encountered out there on the naked line, it had been real, and it was still waiting in the darkness, patient and terrible, for the next people foolish enough to go looking for lights that didn't belong. The sun was setting over the Sonoran Desert 3 nights later, when Thaddeus McCrae found himself back at the station, filling out paperwork that should have been simple but somehow wasn't. Every time he tried to write down what had happened out there on the fence line, his pen would hover over the paper and his mind would go blank. How do you explain that your equipment malfunctioned for no reason, that you heard whistling in the middle of nowhere, that a water jug with a strange symbol on it made your head feel like it was splitting apart? In the end, he'd written up something vague about possible smuggler activity and equipment failure, knowing it was inadequate but unable to do better. Ira hadn't been much help either. His partner had grown quiet over the past few days, jumping at shadows and checking his GPS unit constantly as if expecting it to fail again at any moment. They'd been assigned to different sectors since that night, which Thaddeus suspected wasn't coincidental. Someone upstairs had read between the lines of their reports and decided they needed some time apart. That was fine with him. He wasn't sure he wanted to talk about what had happened anyway. Wasn't sure there were words for it that wouldn't make him sound like he'd lost his mind. He was just finishing up the last of the forms when Eula May Kincannon walked into the station. She was a fixture around here, a local ranch hand who'd lived in the area her whole life and knew the desert better than most of the agents ever would. Her family had owned land along the border for 3 generations, and she had a standing arrangement with Border Patrol to report any suspicious activity she came across. She was in her 60s now, weathered and tough as old leather, with eyes that didn't miss much. She nodded at Thaddeus as she approached the desk, her boots leaving dusty prints on the linoleum floor. "Evening, Miss Eula," Thaddeus said, setting down his pen. "What brings you in? Found something you might want to see." Her voice was rough, the product of decades of cigarettes and desert wind. "Out on the north edge of my property, near that stretch of fence where your boys have been having all that trouble." Thaddeus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of something?" Eula May reached into her jacket and pulled out a plastic bag. Inside was another water jug, smaller than the one he and Ira had found, but marked with the same impossible symbol. She set it on the desk between them, and Thaddeus had to resist the urge to push it away. Even through the plastic, even in the fluorescent light of the station, that symbol seemed to writhe and shift, hurting his eyes when he looked at it directly. "Found 3 of these scattered around my northern fence line," Eula May said. "All marked the same way, and that's not all." She pulled out her phone, swiped through a few photos, then turned the screen toward him. "Found these tracks too, Thought at first they might be coyote, but look at the spacing, look at the depth. Thaddeus leaned in to study the photos. The tracks were wrong. That much was immediately clear. They were too large, for one thing, and spaced too far apart, as if whatever had made them had been taking enormous strides. The depth was inconsistent too. Some tracks pressed deep into the sand while others barely made an impression, as if the weight of whatever was walking had been shifting constantly. And there were a lot of them, crisscrossing back and forth across what looked like a quarter-mile stretch of desert. "When did you take these?" he asked. "This morning, just after sunrise." Eula May tucked her phone back into her jacket. "Wasn't there yesterday when I did my rounds? Whatever made them came through last night." She paused, studying his face with those sharp eyes. "You know something about this, don't you? You and that partner of yours found something out there." Thaddeus hesitated. Eula May had lived here her whole life. If anyone would believe him, it would be her. And he found himself suddenly desperate to talk to someone about it, to share the weight of what he'd seen with another person who might understand. He glanced around the station. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of agents on the far side of the room, too far away to overhear. He leaned forward and told her everything in a low voice, watching her face for signs of disbelief or mockery. He found neither. When he finished, Eula May was quiet for a long moment. She pulled out a cigarette, looked at it, then seemed to remember she was inside and put it away again. Finally, she nodded slowly, as if he'd just confirmed something she'd already suspected. "My grandfather used to talk about places like that," she said. "Called them thin spots. Places where the barrier between here and somewhere else got worn down. He said there were a handful of them scattered along the border, and that smart folks stayed away from them after dark." She tapped the plastic bag with one calloused finger. "This symbol? He drew something like this once, told me it was a marker. A warning to anyone who knew how to read it. A warning about what? About crossing over." Eula May's voice had gone flat. "He said there were things that lived in those thin spots. Things that didn't belong here but couldn't quite leave either. They were stuck, see? Trapped between one place and another. And they didn't much like it. Made them angry. Made them dangerous." Thaddeus felt that cold feeling in his stomach spread to his chest. Did he ever say what they were? Where they came from? He had theories, old stories passed down from his own grandfather, who'd heard them from the people who lived here before we did. But theories aren't facts, and stories aren't proof. She stood up, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "What I can tell you for certain is that you need to stay away from that stretch of fence. Whatever's out there, it's getting more active, more bold. Those tracks I found, some of them came right up to my fence line, close enough to my house that I should have heard something. But I didn't. It was dead quiet all night, even when whatever it was must have been right outside my window." After Eula May left, Thaddeus sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the water jug in its plastic bag. He should log it as evidence, tag it, and file it away. But something stopped him. Some instinct that said having this thing in the station, even locked up, was a bad idea. In the end, he shoved it in his locker and tried to forget about it, though he knew that wouldn't work. The symbol was already burned into his memory, appearing behind his eyelids every time he blinked. 2 nights later, he was assigned back to the Sonoran sector. He'd requested a different area, tried to get himself moved to literally anywhere else, but there weren't enough agents to go around and someone had to patrol the border. Ira was off duty, which was probably for the best. Thaddeus wasn't sure his partner would have agreed to come back out here, not after what they'd experienced. Instead, he was riding solo tonight, just him and his truck in the desert stretching away into darkness on all sides. The first few hours passed without incident. He drove his usual route, checking sensor stations and scanning the fence line with his spotlight, seeing nothing but empty desert and the occasional kangaroo rat frozen in his beams. The night was clear, the stars so bright they cast faint shadows, and if it weren't for the memory of that whistling, that impossible symbol, he might have found it peaceful. But the memory was there, and it colored everything, turning each shadow into a potential threat and every sound into something sinister. He was approaching the area where he and Ira had found the first water jug when his radio crackled to life. For a moment, there was just static, thick and heavy, and then a voice came through. It was distorted, barely intelligible, but it sounded like someone calling for help. Thaddeus grabbed the handset, keyed the mic. "This is Unit 7. Say again. I didn't copy." "Who is this?" More static, and then the voice came through again, clearer this time, but still wrong somehow. The words were English, but the cadence was off, too fast and too slow at the same time, like a recording that had been sped up and slowed down randomly. "Help. Fence line. Can't. Trapped. What's your location?" Thaddeus was already turning the truck around, heading toward the fence. "Give me a grid reference." The voice dissolved back into static, and then suddenly his radio went dead. Completely silent. Not even the usual background hiss of an open channel. He tried switching frequencies, tried calling dispatch, got nothing. And just like that, he was cut off again, alone in the desert with malfunctioning equipment and a distress call that had come from nowhere. He should turn back. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to turn the truck around and drive back to the station, report the equipment failure, and let someone else deal with it. But if there was really someone out there, someone in trouble, he couldn't just leave them. It was his job to help, to protect, even if it meant going back to a place he'd sworn he'd never return to. He kept driving, watching his GPS unit flicker and jump as he got closer to the naked line, as Ira had called it. The fence came into view, and Thaddeus slowed to a stop, playing his spotlight along the barrier. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the same steel posts and mesh wire that ran for hundreds of miles in both directions. But then the beam caught something, a flicker of movement near one of the posts, and he felt his breath catch. There was someone there, a figure standing perfectly still on the Mexican side of the fence, facing him. Thaddeus grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck, his other hand resting on his sidearm. The figure didn't move as he approached, didn't react to his presence at all. As he got closer, he could see it was a man, tall and thin, wearing clothes that looked strange even in the dim light. Old-fashioned, like something from 100 years ago, all rough fabric and hand-stitched seams. The man's face was shadowed, hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, and his hands hung at his sides, completely motionless. "Hey," Thaddeus called out, stopping about 10 feet from the fence. "You okay? You need help?" The figure's head tilted slowly, as if considering the question. When it spoke, its voice was the same distorted sound he'd heard on the radio, that too fast, too slow cadence that made his skin crawl. "Help," it said. "Yes, help. What's wrong? Are you injured?" Thaddeus moved closer, playing his flashlight over the figure. In the beam, he could see the man's clothes were covered in dust, as if he'd been walking through the desert for days. But there was something else, too. Something that made Thaddeus's hand tighten on his sidearm. The dust didn't look right. It was too uniform, too perfectly distributed, as if it had been applied rather than accumulated naturally. "Trapped," the figure said. "Between. Can't cross, can't leave? Between what?" But even as he asked the question, Thaddeus thought he knew the answer. Between here and somewhere else. Between this world and whatever existed in those thin spots Eula May's grandfather had talked about. The figure took a step closer to the fence, and in the flashlight beam, Thaddeus could finally see its face. He wished immediately that he hadn't. It was wrong. Not in any way he could easily describe, but wrong in fundamental ways that his brain refused to process. The features were human, or close enough, but they didn't quite line up correctly. The eyes were too far apart, or maybe too close together, shifting every time he tried to focus on them. The mouth moved when it spoke, but the movements didn't match the words, as if the sounds were coming from somewhere else entirely. And the skin, when the light hit it directly, seemed to ripple and shift like water, revealing glimpses of something underneath that Thaddeus's mind simply couldn't accept. "Stay back," he said, his voice coming out higher than he intended. "Don't come any closer to the fence." The figure stopped, cocking its head at that impossible angle again. "Marked," it said. "The water, the signs. You found them. You saw. What are they? What do they mean?" "Boundary," the figure said. "Warning, stay away. But you came back. They always come back." It raised one hand, pointing at Thaddeus with a finger that seemed too long, too jointed. "You're marked now, too. It knows you. It's watching." Before Thaddeus could respond, the figure took a step backward and seemed to blur, its outline becoming indistinct. For a moment, it looked like there were multiple versions of it standing in the same space, overlapping and out of sync with each other. Then it was gone, simply erased from existence as if it had never been there at all. Thaddeus stood frozen, his flashlight beam illuminating empty desert on the other side of the fence, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He ran back to the truck and threw himself inside, locking the doors even though he knew that wouldn't help if that thing decided to come after him. His hands were shaking as he tried the radio again, and this time it worked. Dispatch's voice coming through clear and strong, asking for his status. He told them everything was fine, that he'd had some equipment trouble but it was resolved now, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. They acknowledged and signed off, apparently satisfied with his explanation. Thaddeus started the engine and pulled away from the fence, but he couldn't stop checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the road behind him. The drive back to the station felt like it took hours, though his watch insisted it was only 20 minutes. When he finally pulled into the lot, he sat in the truck for a long time, trying to slow his breathing, trying to convince himself that what he'd seen was real and not some stress-induced hallucination. But he knew it was real. He could still hear that distorted voice in his head, could still see that wrong face with its shifting features. And worse, he understood what it had meant when it said he was marked. Whatever existed out there in the thin spots, it had noticed him. It knew who he was. And it was watching. Thaddeus didn't sleep that night. He tried, lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed that encounter at the fence over and over again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that figure with its wrong face and shifting features, heard that distorted voice telling him he was marked. The word echoed in his head like a curse, heavy with implications he didn't want to examine too closely. By the time dawn broke, he'd given up on rest entirely and was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, trying to figure out what to do next. The smart thing would be to request a transfer, get himself assigned to a different sector or even a different state. Put as much distance between himself and that stretch of desert as possible and try to forget any of this had ever happened. But he knew it wouldn't work. Whatever was happening out there, whatever existed in those thin spots, it had noticed him. It knew who he was. Running wouldn't change that, wouldn't make him any safer, and besides, there was a part of him, a stubborn, stupid part, that needed to understand what was going on, that needed answers, even if those answers terrified him. He was still sitting there when his phone rang. It was Ira calling from his personal cell instead of going through official channels. That alone was enough to tell Thaddeus this wasn't a routine check-in. He answered on the third ring, and his partner's voice came through tight and strained, barely above a whisper. "Thad, you need to come over here right now. Don't ask questions, just come." "What's wrong? Where are you?" "I'm at home. Please, I need you to see something. I need to know I'm not losing my mind." Thaddeus had known Ira long enough to recognize genuine fear when he heard it. He grabbed his keys and was out the door within 2 minutes, making the 20-minute drive to his partner's house in 15. Ira lived in a small ranch-style home on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with a decent yard and enough space to not hear your neighbors. When Thaddeus pulled up, Ira was waiting on the front porch, looking like he hadn't slept any better than Thaddeus had. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair uncombed, and he was gripping a cup of coffee so hard his knuckles had gone white. "Thanks for coming," Ira said, as Thaddeus climbed the porch steps. "I know this is weird, calling you like this, but I didn't know who else to talk to." He set down his coffee cup, and Thaddeus noticed his hands were shaking. "Come around back. I need to show you something." They walked around the side of the house to the backyard, which was mostly dirt and scrub grass with a few mesquite trees providing shade. Ira led him to the far corner of the property, near the fence that separated his yard from the open desert beyond. There, scattered across maybe a 15-foot radius, were water jugs. Dozens of them, all the same size and type they'd been finding along the border, and every single one was marked with that symbol, the same intricate pattern of curves and angles that hurt to look at, drawn in black marker on the plastic surface. "I woke up this morning and found them like this," Ira said. His voice was shaking now too, matching his hands. "All of them just here on my property, in my yard." He turned to look at Thaddeus, and there was something desperate in his eyes. "How did they get here? Who put them here? I've got motion sensor lights all over this place, cameras on the corners of the house. Nothing triggered, nothing recorded. They just appeared." Thaddeus moved closer to examine the jugs. They were arranged in a pattern, he realized, though not one he could immediately recognize. It reminded him of the stone circle they'd found in the desert that first night, that same sense of deliberate placement and hidden meaning. Some of the jugs were upright, others tipped on their sides, and the symbols on each one were slightly different, variations on the same basic theme. As he studied them, that buzzing sensation started up behind his eyes again, growing stronger the longer he looked. "Don't," Ira said sharply. "Don't stare at them too long. I made that mistake already. It's like they get inside your head, make you see things that aren't there." He rubbed his eyes, wincing. "I've been hearing that whistling all morning. Even inside the house with all the windows closed, I can hear it. And I keep seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. Shadows that shouldn't be there." "We need to report this," Thaddeus said, though even as he spoke the words he knew how insane they would sound. What were they supposed to tell their supervisor? That mysterious water jugs had appeared in Ira's yard overnight, marked with symbols that made your head hurt? That they were being watched by something that lived in thin spots along the border? They'd be laughed out of the station at best, put on psychiatric leave at worst. And tell them what exactly? Ira had apparently been thinking along the same lines. That we're being haunted? That there's something out there in the desert that can appear and disappear at will? They'll think we've cracked, that the stress of the job finally got to us. He picked up one of the jugs, turning it over in his hands. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe we are cracking. Before Thaddeus could respond, a sound cut through the morning air. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew steadily louder. Whistling. the same slow, mournful melody they'd heard out in the desert that first night. Both men froze, their eyes darting around the yard, trying to pinpoint the source. But the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them, pressing in from all sides. Ira dropped the water jug, his hand going to his hip where his service weapon would normally be. But he was off duty, unarmed, and Thaddeus could see the panic rising in his partner's face. "Inside," Thaddeus said, grabbing Ira's arm. "Now." They ran for the house, and Thaddeus was reaching for the back door when something made him look up. There, standing on the roof of Ira's house, was a figure, tall and impossibly thin. Silhouetted against the morning sky, it stood perfectly balanced on the peak of the roof with its arms hanging loosely at its sides. Even from this distance, even with the sun in his eyes, Thaddeus could tell it was the same thing he'd seen at the fence. That same wrong quality, that sense of something pretending to be human but not quite getting the details right. The figure tilted its head, studying them, and then it opened its mouth. The whistling grew louder, so loud it felt like it was coming from inside Thaddeus's skull, and he realized with a sick jolt that the sound was coming from the figure itself. Not from its mouth exactly, but from somewhere inside it, as if it were hollow and the wind was blowing through it. The melody changed, shifting from mournful to something else, something that reminded Thaddeus of laughter but twisted and wrong. "Get inside." Ira yanked the door open and shoved Thaddeus through, following close behind and slamming it shut. They stood in the kitchen, breathing hard, while that whistling continued outside. It went on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, and then it cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse. Thaddeus moved to the window, peering out through the blinds at the roof. The figure was gone, but the water jugs were still there in the yard, their symbols gleaming in the sunlight. "We have to do something," Ira said. He'd moved to the sink, was splashing water on his face with shaking hands. "We can't just ignore this. It's not going away. It's getting worse." Thaddeus knew he was right. Whatever was happening, it was escalating. First the lights in the desert, then the water jugs, then the encounter at the fence, and now this. The thing was getting bolder, making its presence known in ways that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away. It wanted them to know it was there, wanted them to be afraid. And it was working. Thaddeus was more frightened than he'd ever been in his life, including the time he'd been shot at during a drug bust 3 years ago. At least then he'd understood what he was dealing with. This was different. This was something outside the normal rules of reality, and he had no idea how to fight it. "Eula May," he said suddenly. "She might know something. Her grandfather talked about these thin spots, said there were old stories about them. Maybe she knows more than she told me." They left the water jugs where they were, neither of them willing to touch them again, and drove to Eula May's ranch in Ira's truck. The ranch was about 15 miles outside of town, a sprawling property with cattle grazing in the distance and a house that looked like it had been there since the 1800s. Eula May was in the yard when they pulled up, working on an old tractor that had seen better days. She looked up as they approached, took one look at their faces, and set down her wrench. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Or something worse. We need to talk to you," Thaddeus said. "About those thin spots your grandfather mentioned. About what's really out there." Eula May was quiet for a long moment, studying them both with those sharp eyes. Then she nodded slowly and gestured toward the house. "Come on inside. This isn't a conversation to have in the open." They followed her into the house, which was cool and dark after the bright morning sun. She led them to a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood, poured them each a cup without asking if they wanted one, and sat down at the table. Thaddeus and Ira took seats across from her, and for a minute nobody spoke. Eula May seemed to be gathering her thoughts, deciding how much to tell them. Finally, she sighed and began. "My grandfather was half Apache," she said. "His grandmother was full-blooded, lived on this land before it was a ranch, before there were borders or fences or any of that. She told him stories about places where the world got thin, places where the barrier between here and the other side wore down to almost nothing." She took a sip of her coffee. "Most people think the other side is heaven or hell, something like that. But according to the old stories, it's not. It's just elsewhere. A place that exists alongside ours but separate from it. And sometimes in certain spots the two places get too close together." "What happens when they do?" Ira asked. "Things slip through. Both ways sometimes. Creatures that don't belong here get trapped in between, can't go forward and can't go back. They're stuck, see, caught in a kind of limbo. And over time, that does something to them. Drives them mad, or as close to mad as something like that can get. They become dangerous, territorial. They start marking their territory, warning others away, but also trying to lure people in." Eula May set down her cup. "The symbols you've been finding? Those are markers, warnings for those who know how to read them, bait for those who don't." "Why us?" Thaddeus heard the desperation in his own voice. "Why is this thing targeting us specifically?" "Because you found it," Eula May said simply. "You stumbled into its territory, saw it when it didn't want to be seen, and now it knows you. It's marked you, claimed you in a sense." She leaned forward, her expression grave. "These things, they're like predators. Once they've identified prey, they don't let go easily. They'll follow you, haunt you, try to drive you mad, or lure you back into their territory, and if you do go back—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "How do we stop it?" Ira's voice was barely above a whisper. "There has to be a way to make it leave us alone. The old stories say you can't kill something that's already caught between life and death. Can't banish it. Can't trap it. The only thing you can do is avoid it. Stay away from the thin spots, don't engage with it, don't acknowledge its presence. Eventually, if you ignore it long enough, it'll lose interest and move on to someone else." Eula May's expression suggested she didn't entirely believe this would work, but it was the only option she could offer. "Whatever you do, don't go back to that stretch of desert. Don't give it what it wants." They left Eula May's ranch with more questions than answers, but at least now they had some context for what was happening. The drive back to town was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts. Thaddeus kept thinking about what Eula May had said, about how these things claimed their prey and didn't let go. He wondered how many other Border Patrol agents had encountered something like this over the years, how many had been marked and haunted and driven to the edge of sanity. He wondered if any of them had survived. When they reached Ira's house, the water jugs were still there in the yard, but something had changed. They'd been rearranged, moved into a different pattern that formed a rough arrow pointing toward the desert, toward the thin spot. The message was clear. It wanted them to come back. It was waiting for them. "I'm calling in sick tomorrow," Ira said, as they stood in the driveway, staring at the arrow of water jugs. "Maybe the rest of the week. I can't go back out there right now." Thaddeus wanted to say he'd do the same, but he knew it wouldn't help. The thing had found Ira at his home, had marked him here on his own property. Calling in sick wouldn't protect him. Nothing would, except maybe doing what Eula May had suggested and trying to ignore it. Trying to pretend it didn't exist, even as it surrounded them with signs of its presence. It seemed impossible, but what choice did they have? "Yeah," Thaddeus said finally. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." He drove home as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the whole way he could feel something watching him. Not from the road, not from any specific direction, but from somewhere close by. Somewhere just out of sight. And he knew, with a certainty that made his stomach turn, that this was far from over. Whatever existed in that thin spot, it had marked him and Ira, and it wouldn't rest until it got what it wanted. He just had no idea what that was. 3 days passed. 3 days during which Thaddeus tried to follow Eula May's advice and ignore the signs, pretend none of it was happening. He went to work, filed his reports, drove his patrols in sectors far away from the naked line. He avoided Ira's calls at first, knowing his partner was struggling even more than he was, not wanting to feed into the shared paranoia that was threatening to consume them both. He tried to sleep, tried to eat, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. Everything kept slipping away. The whistling followed him everywhere. Sometimes it was faint, barely audible beneath the sound of traffic or the hum of the station's air conditioning. Other times it was loud enough to make his teeth ache, that same mournful melody cutting through everything else. He'd be sitting at his desk and suddenly hear it, look up to find his coworkers going about their business as if nothing was happening. He'd be driving home, and it would come through his radio, overriding whatever station he'd been listening to. Always that same tune, always just on the edge of comprehension, as if it were trying to tell him something in a language he'd never learned. On the 4th night, he woke up at 3 a.m. to find his bedroom window open. He knew he'd locked it before going to bed, had checked it twice because he'd been checking everything twice lately. But there it was, wide open with the curtains billowing in the desert breeze. And there on his windowsill, placed with deliberate care, was a water jug marked with that symbol. Thaddeus stared at it for a long time, his heart hammering in his chest, before he finally got up and approached. The symbol seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, though he knew that was impossible. It was just marker on plastic, nothing more. He picked up the jug, and the moment his fingers touched it, he felt a jolt run through his body. Not painful, exactly, but intense, like touching a live wire. Images flooded his mind, rapid and disjointed. The desert at night, the fence line, figures moving in the darkness, too many to count, all of them wrong in that same fundamental way. And underneath it all, a voice, speaking in that distorted cadence. Come back, come back, come back. Thaddeus dropped the jug and stumbled away from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed his phone and called Ira, not caring that it was the middle of the night. His partner answered on the first ring, sounding wide awake. "It's in my house," Ira said before Thaddeus could speak. "I can hear it moving around downstairs. I locked every door, every window, but it got in anyway. Thad, what do we do? What the hell do we do?" "Stay where you are. I'm coming over." "No, don't. Don't leave your house. I think that's what it wants. It wants us to run, wants us to panic and make mistakes." Ira's voice was shaking, but there was a manic edge to it that worried Thaddeus more than the fear. "I've been thinking about what Eula May said, about how these things claim their territory, mark their prey. What if we're not the prey? What if we're supposed to be something else? What are you talking about?" "The symbols, Thad, the water jugs. They're not just warnings, they're invitations. It's been trying to get us to come back to the thin spot, to cross over. What if that's what it needs? What if it can't leave that place on its own? But if someone willingly enters its territory, it can trade places with them." Ira laughed, a high, brittle sound, like one of those old stories about fairy circles. Step inside and you're trapped forever, but something else gets to step out. Thaddeus wanted to tell him that was crazy, that he was letting the fear twist his thoughts into paranoid delusions. But the more he thought about it, the more sense it made in a horrible, twisted way. All the markers, all the signs, all the encounters, they'd been leading them toward one thing, getting them to voluntarily return to that stretch of desert, to step into the thin spot and let whatever was waiting there take their place in the world. So we don't go, Thaddeus said. We stay away, no matter what. Eventually, it has to give up. Does it? Ira's voice had gone quiet. Does it really? Because I don't think it does. I think it'll keep escalating, keep pushing, until we either break or give it what it wants. And I'm already breaking, Thad. I can feel it. Every time I hear that whistling, every time I see one of those symbols, it's like it's carving pieces out of my mind. How long before there's nothing left? Thaddeus didn't have an answer for that. They talked for a few more minutes, trying to reassure each other, but the words felt hollow and useless. Finally, Ira said he was going to try to get some sleep, though they both knew that was unlikely. After he hung up, Thaddeus sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the water jug on his windowsill, and tried to figure out what to do next. He must have dozed off at some point because the next thing he knew, sunlight was streaming through the open window and his alarm was going off. The water jug was gone. He searched his entire room, looked out the window, checked the rest of the house, but it had vanished as completely as if it had never been there. For a moment, he wondered if he'd dreamed the whole thing, but his window was still open and he could see the faint outline where the jug had sat on the sill, a ring of condensation that hadn't quite evaporated yet. He called Ira again but got no answer. Tried 3 more times over the next hour with the same result. Finally, he drove to his partner's house, feeling a growing sense of dread with every mile. Ira's truck was in the driveway, but the house looked empty, all the curtains drawn and no lights visible inside. Thaddeus knocked on the front door, called out Ira's name, got no response. The door was unlocked, which set off alarm bells immediately. Ira was meticulous about home security, especially after the water jugs had appeared in his yard. Inside, the house was a mess. Not ransacked or torn apart, but disturbed in subtle ways that were somehow worse. Furniture had been moved a few inches out of position. Pictures on the walls hung slightly crooked. The kitchen cabinets were all open, revealing their contents. And everywhere on every surface were water jugs marked with that symbol. Hundreds of them, far more than could fit in the house through normal means, covering the floors and counters and tables like some kind of grotesque infestation. Ira? Thaddeus moved through the house, careful not to touch any of the jugs, his hand resting on his sidearm. Ira, where are you? He found the note in the bedroom, propped against a pillow on the unmade bed. The handwriting was Ira's, but shaky and uneven, as if written by someone whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. I can't take it anymore. It's in my head all the time now, that whistling, and I see it everywhere I look, in mirrors, in windows, in the shadows. It's not going to stop. It's never going to stop unless I give it what it wants. I'm sorry, Thad. I tried to fight it, but I'm not strong enough. Maybe if I go, it'll leave you alone. Maybe that's how it works. One of us has to cross over, and the other gets to be free. I hope that's true. I hope you make it out of this. Don't come looking for me. Don't make the same mistake I did. Just forget about the naked line and everything that happened there. Forget about me. Ira. Thaddeus read the note 3 times, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. He knew where Ira had gone, knew what his partner was planning to do, and he knew he should listen to the note, should stay away and let whatever was going to happen, happen. But Ira was his partner, his friend, and he couldn't just abandon him to whatever waited in that thin spot. He had to try to stop him, even if it meant walking into a trap. The drive to the Sonoran sector felt like it took forever, and no time at all. The sun was high in the sky. the desert shimmering with heat, and Thaddeus kept expecting his radio to crackle to life with news that another agent had found Ira wandering the desert. Disoriented, but okay. But the radio stayed silent except for routine chatter, and when he reached the stretch of fence where it had all begun, Ira's truck was there waiting. The vehicle was empty, driver's door hanging open, keys still in the ignition. Thaddeus grabbed his flashlight even though it was broad daylight and followed the tracks leading away from the truck. They headed straight toward the fence, straight toward the spot where he'd seen that wrong figure standing in the darkness. The tracks were deep and evenly spaced at first, but they got more erratic as they went, swerving and stumbling as if Ira had been fighting with himself, trying to turn back but unable to stop moving forward. The tracks ended at the fence. No sign of a crossing, no cut wires or dugout sections. They just stopped as if Ira had walked straight through solid metal. Thaddeus stared at the spot, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. People couldn't walk through chain-link fencing. It wasn't possible. But the tracks didn't lie, and neither did the single item he found lying on the ground on this side of the barrier. Ira's badge, the metal gleaming in the sunlight, still clipped to its holder. Thaddeus picked it up with trembling hands, and the moment he did, he heard it. The whistling, louder than it had ever been, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The desert around him seemed to darken, even though the sun was still high, shadows lengthening and deepening in ways that defied the laws of physics. And there, standing on the other side of the fence exactly where the tracks ended, was Ira. Except it wasn't Ira. Not really. It had Ira's face, Ira's build, wore Ira's clothes. But something was wrong about it. The proportions were slightly off, the movements too fluid and too jerky at the same time. It stood there with its arms hanging at its sides, head cocked at that impossible angle, and when it spoke it was with Ira's voice but in that distorted cadence that made Thaddeus's skin crawl. "He crossed over," it said. "Willingly. The bargain is complete. He stays. I leave." The thing that looked like Ira smiled, and the expression was so wrong on his partner's face that Thaddeus had to look away. "You're marked, too. When you're ready, when you can't take it anymore, you'll cross over as well. And then we'll both be free." "Where is he?" Thaddeus demanded, his voice cracking. "What did you do with him?" "He's where he chose to be, in between, neither here nor there. He'll wander those spaces until the end of time, or until someone takes his place." The thing tilted its head the other way, studying Thaddeus with eyes that were Ira's but held nothing human behind them. "You could save him. Step through the fence, take his place, and he could come back. That's how it works. 1 for 1, a trade." Thaddeus took a step back, then another, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might explode. The thing was trying to lure him in, trying to get him to make the same mistake Ira had made. But what if it was telling the truth? What if there was a way to bring his partner back, to undo what had happened? What if all he had to do was step through that fence? No, that was the madness talking, the same madness that had taken Ira. He couldn't save his partner by destroying himself. All he could do was survive, bear witness, and make sure no one else stumbled into this nightmare. He turned and ran back to his truck, throwing himself inside and slamming the door. In the rearview mirror, he could see the thing that wore Ira's face watching him, still standing on the other side of the fence with that terrible smile. Thaddeus drove back to the station and filed a missing person report. He told them Ira had disappeared while on patrol, that he'd found his truck abandoned near the border fence with no sign of struggle or forced entry. It was technically the truth, even if it left out the parts no one would believe. The search went on for 3 days, dozens of agents combing the desert, helicopters flying grid patterns overhead. They never found anything except Ira's badge, which Thaddeus had turned in as evidence. After a week, the search was officially called off. Ira Pendleton was classified as missing, presumed dead, though no body was ever recovered. His family held a memorial service that Thaddeus attended but couldn't bring himself to speak at. What could he say? That he'd watched something wearing Ira's face tell him his partner was trapped in a place between worlds. That he'd been offered a chance to save him but had been too afraid to take it? Thaddeus requested a transfer the day after the memorial. To his surprise, it was approved immediately, as if someone upstairs was eager to move him away from the Sonoran sector. He was reassigned to a station in New Mexico, hundreds of miles from the Naked Line and everything that had happened there. He told himself it was over, that the distance would protect him, that whatever existed in that thin spot would lose interest and move on to someone else. But deep down, he knew better. He could still hear the whistling sometimes, faint and distant, but unmistakable. He still saw water jugs marked with that symbol in his dreams, sometimes in places they shouldn't be when he was awake. And every time he looked in a mirror, he had to check carefully to make sure his reflection moved exactly the way it should, that there was nothing wrong about the proportions or the timing. Because he knew what Ulame had said was true. Once these things marked you, they didn't let go. The thing that had taken Ira's place was out there somewhere, walking around in his partner's skin, waiting. And Thaddeus was marked, claimed, just like Ira had been. It was only a matter of time before he either broke like his partner had or found some way to fight back that didn't exist yet. He didn't know which would come first. He just knew that every night when he closed his eyes, he saw that stretch of desert, that fence line, that impossible barrier between here and somewhere else. And he knew that sooner or later, he'd have to go back. 3 months after transferring to New Mexico, Thaddeus was on patrol when his GPS started acting up, the coordinates jumping and shifting in a way that was becoming sickeningly familiar. He looked up from the device and saw it in the distance, a pale flicker of light moving sideways across the desert, pulsing in that same deliberate rhythm. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and for a long moment he sat there, watching the light, feeling that familiar dread settle into his bones. The Naked Line had found him again, or maybe it had never let him go in the first place. Either way, the message was clear. You can't run from something that exists outside the normal rules of space and time. You can only endure it, survive it, and hope that whatever lives in those thin spots eventually finds prey that's easier to claim. Thaddeus put the truck in gear and drove away from the light, refusing to look back. But he could feel it watching him, patient and hungry, as it had been from the very beginning, and he knew that this wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until he either crossed through that invisible barrier himself or found some way to close it forever. He suspected he'd run out of luck long before he figured out which option was possible. The Rio Grande was running low that October, lower than Hollis Varnell had seen it in his 8 years with Border Patrol. The drought had turned sections of the river into little more than muddy streams, exposing sandbars and rock formations that normally stayed hidden beneath the surface. It made his job easier in some ways, harder in others. Crossings increased when the water was shallow, but it also meant more places to watch, more routes to patrol. He'd been pulling double shifts for the past 2 weeks, and the exhaustion was starting to show in the way his hands shook when he poured his morning coffee. Tonight, he was working the stretch between Del Rio and Eagle Pass, a 20-mile section of river that had been relatively quiet lately. Too quiet, according to some of the other agents. There was talk that the cartels had shifted their operations elsewhere, or that increased patrols had finally deterred the smugglers. But Hollis had been doing this long enough to know that silence along the border usually meant something was brewing. People didn't just stop crossing. They changed tactics, found new routes, waited for the right moment. The The question was always when, not if. He was sitting in his truck at one of the observation points thermal camera trained on the opposite bank when his radio crackled. It was Orson Keene, his sector supervisor, calling from the station 15 miles north. Orson was old school, been with Border Patrol since before they had half the technology they used now, and he had a sixth sense about the river that Hollis had learned to trust. "Varnell, you getting anything on thermal down there?" Orson's voice was rough, worn down by years of cigarettes and desert dust. "Negative. It's dead quiet tonight. Water's so low I can see halfway across in some spots." Hollis adjusted the camera, scanning the Mexican side of the river for any heat signatures. "Why, you hearing something different?" "Maybe. We've been getting some weird sensor hits about 3 miles south of your position. Pattern doesn't match anything human. Could be animals, but..." Orson paused and Hollis could hear him tapping something. Probably a pencil against his desk like he always did when he was thinking. "Could be equipment malfunction too. These sensors have been acting up all week. But I want you to check it out anyway. Take a drive down there, see if anything looks off." "Copy that. Heading south now." Hollis put the truck in gear and started down the dirt road that paralleled the river. The night was clear and cold. The kind of cold that came with desert darkness when there was no cloud cover to trap the heat. His headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating mesquite trees and scattered cacti, their shadows stretching long and distorted. He'd made this drive 1,000 times, knew every curve and pothole. But tonight, something felt different. The air had a thickness to it, a weight that made it hard to breathe, and the usual sounds of the desert seemed muted and distant. He reached the sensor station in about 10 minutes, a small metal box on a pole that monitored ground vibrations and heat signatures in a 100-yard radius. The indicator light was blinking red, which meant it had detected something. But when Hollis checked the readout, the data made no sense. The sensor was registering movement, multiple contacts, but the pattern was wrong. The heat signatures were there 1 second and gone the next, appearing and disappearing in a way that suggested either the sensor was broken or something was moving in and out of the water repeatedly. Hollis grabbed his spotlight and walked down to the riverbank. The Rio Grande stretched away into darkness on both sides, the water moving slowly over exposed rocks and sandbars. He played the light across the surface, watching for ripples or disturbances, but everything looked normal, quiet, empty. He was about to head back to the truck when he noticed something odd about the water itself. In the beam of his spotlight, it looked darker than it should, almost black, and when he crouched down to get a closer look, he realized the surface was perfectly still. No current, no movement at all, as if the river had frozen in place. That wasn't possible. The Rio Grande never stopped flowing, not completely. Even in drought conditions, there was always some current, however slight. But this section of water looked like glass, smooth and unblemished, reflecting the stars above with perfect clarity. Hollis reached out with one hand, intending to touch the surface, but something stopped him. Some instinct deep in his lizard brain that screamed danger, that told him putting his hand in that water would be a mistake he wouldn't live to regret. He pulled back and stood up, his heart rate elevated for reasons he couldn't quite explain. The thermal camera on his belt was beeping, indicating heat signatures nearby, but when he raised it to look, there was nothing there. Just empty riverbank and still water. He was reaching for his radio to report the sensor malfunction when he saw them. Tracks in the mud at the water's edge. Human footprints, bare feet, leading out of the river and up the bank toward the U.S. side. That was strange, but not unprecedented. People crossed barefoot all the time, trying to avoid leaving recognizable shoe treads. What made Hollis's skin crawl was that the tracks were wrong. They were too evenly spaced, too perfectly formed, as if whoever had made them had been walking with mechanical precision. And they were fresh, the edges still sharp and undefined, but there was no water in them, no moisture at all, despite the fact that they led directly out of the river. Hollis followed the tracks with his light, watching them continue up the bank for maybe 20 feet before they simply stopped, not faded away, not obscured by rocks or vegetation. They just ended in the middle of open ground, as if the person who'd made them had vanished into thin air. He walked over to where the last print was, crouched down to examine it more closely. The impression was deep, suggesting significant weight, but there was something else too. A smell, faint but unmistakable, like river water in decay, old and stagnant. The kind of smell you got from pools that had been sitting too long in the sun. His radio crackled again, making him jump. It was Orson, asking for a status update. Hollis keyed the mic, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm at the sensor location, getting some unusual readings. Found tracks leading out of the water, but they don't go anywhere. Possible sensor malfunction, but I'm not sure." "What do you mean they don't go anywhere?" "They just stop. Middle of the riverbank, no explanation. And the water here is—" Hollis paused, trying to find words that wouldn't make him sound crazy. "It's not moving at all, like it's frozen, but it's not cold enough for that." There was a long silence on the other end. When Orson spoke again, his voice had changed, gone flat and careful. "Varnell, I want you to get back in your truck and return to the observation point. Don't investigate further. I'm sending backup your way." "Copy, but I don't think there's anyone here. Whatever triggered the sensor is gone now. Just do it, Hollis. I've seen this before. Get back to your truck, now." The urgency in Orson's voice sent a chill down Hollis's spine. He'd never heard his supervisor sound like that. Not in 8 years. He turned to head back to his vehicle, and that's when he noticed the water had changed. It was moving again, but not in any natural way. The surface was rippling, small concentric circles spreading outward from multiple points, as if something beneath was rising toward the surface. Hollis watched, transfixed, as the ripples grew larger and the water in the center of each circle began to bulge upward, forming small mounds that glistened in his spotlight beam. He took a step back, then another, unable to look away from whatever was happening in the river. The mounds continued to rise, and he could see now that they weren't just water. There was something solid underneath, something pushing up from below. The shapes were vaguely human, head and shoulders breaking the surface, but they moved wrong, too fluid and too rigid at the same time. And they were all facing toward him, these rising figures, as if they knew exactly where he was standing. Hollis turned and ran. His training told him to assess the threat, maintain visual contact, call for backup, but every survival instinct he possessed was screaming at him to get away from the river, to put as much distance between himself and those things as possible. He made it to his truck and threw himself inside, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he slammed it into gear, tires spinning in the loose dirt as he accelerated away from the riverbank. He'd made it maybe 100 yards when something appeared in his headlights. A figure standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still. Hollis hit the brakes instinctively, and the truck skidded to a stop with the bumper inches from the person. It was a man, or something shaped like a man, standing there barefoot and dripping wet despite the fact that the river was a quarter-mile behind them now. The figure's clothes hung on it strangely, as if they didn't quite fit right, and when the headlights hit its face, Hollis saw that its eyes were wrong. Too large, too reflective, catching the light like an animal's eyes would, but with an intelligence that was distinctly human. The figure tilted its head, studying the truck, and then it smiled. The expression was terrible, too wide and too knowing, revealing teeth that seemed too white and too sharp. It raised one hand and pressed it against the hood of the truck, and Hollis heard metal creak under the pressure. Saw the hood dent inward as if struck by something much heavier than a human hand. Then the figure leaned forward, bringing its face close to the windshield, and opened its mouth. No sound came out, but Hollis could see its throat working, see it forming words that he couldn't hear. His radio exploded into static so loud it hurt his ears. He grabbed for the volume knob, tried to turn it down, but the sound only got worse. Through the white noise, he could hear something else. A voice, or multiple voices layered over each other, speaking in that same distorted cadence he'd heard in the static. They were saying something, repeating it over and over, but he couldn't make out the words. It sounded like his name, or something close to it, but wrong. Backwards, maybe, or in a language that only sounded like English. Hollis threw the truck into reverse and stomped on the gas. The tires shrieked, and the vehicle shot backward, away from the figure in the road. The thing watched him go, still smiling that terrible smile, and then it simply dissolved. 1 second it was there, solid and real, and the next it was just water, splashing down onto the dirt road in a puddle that steamed in the cold night air. Hollis kept reversing until he was a safe distance away, then spun the truck around and headed back north, toward the observation point and away from whatever the hell he'd just encountered. His radio was still screaming static when Orson's voice finally cut through. "Varnell, Hollis, respond. What's your status?" "I'm heading back to the observation point." Hollis's voice sounded strange to his own ears, too high and too fast. "There was something in the road. I don't know what it was. I need backup down here, now." "Already on the way. Just get to a safe position and wait. Don't go near the water again. Do you understand me? Stay away from the river." "What was that thing, Orson? What the hell did I just see?" "We'll talk about it when backup arrives. Just stay in your truck and keep your doors locked." The connection cut out, and Hollis was left alone with the hum of his engine and the sound of his own breathing. He made it back to the observation point and parked with the truck facing away from the river, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror in case anything came up behind him. The thermal camera was going crazy, registering heat signatures all along the riverbank now. Dozens of them, moving in and out of the water in that same impossible pattern. He sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes before another set of headlights appeared in the distance. Backup was arriving, and Hollis had never been so relieved to see another Border Patrol vehicle in his life. But even as help approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. Something that had risen from the depths of the Rio Grande and was waiting patiently for him to make a mistake. And he had a terrible suspicion that whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. The backup that arrived was a younger agent named Torres, someone Hollis had seen around the station but never worked with directly. Torres pulled up alongside his truck, rolled down his window, and gave him a questioning look that suggested he thought this was probably a false alarm. Hollis couldn't blame him. In the glare of multiple vehicle lights, with the desert looking normal and empty, it was easy to believe nothing had happened. But the memory of that figure in the road, the way it had pressed its hand into the hood of his truck, was still fresh and terrifying. "Keene said you had some kind of encounter down by the river." Torres kept his voice neutral, professional. "What are we looking at here?" Hollis climbed out of his truck and led Torres around to the front. In the headlights, the damage was clearly visible. A handprint pressed deep into the metal of the hood, each finger leaving a distinct impression. The metal had buckled inward, creating a dent that would have taken serious force to make. Torres crouched down to examine it, running his fingers along the edge of the impression, and his skeptical expression slowly changed to something closer to concern. "You're saying someone did this? With their hand?" Torres stood up, looking from the dent to Hollis and back again. "That's not possible. You'd need a hell of a lot of force to dent metal like that." "I know what I saw. There was something, standing in the road when I came back from the sensor station. It put its hand on the hood, and the metal just gave way like it was clay." Hollis pulled out his thermal camera and showed Torres the readings. "And the sensors are still going crazy. Look at all these heat signatures along the river. They're not moving like people should move. They're appearing and disappearing." Torres studied the camera readout, his frown deepening. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he pulled out his radio and called Orson. "Supervisor Keene, this is Torres. I'm at Agent Varnell's location. Can confirm unusual damage to his vehicle and anomalous thermal readings. Request permission to investigate the riverbank." Orson's response was immediate and sharp. "Negative. Do not approach the river. Both of you return to the station immediately. That's an order." Torres looked at Hollis, clearly wanting to argue, but years of training won out. "Copy that. Returning to station." He lowered the radio and shook his head. I've never heard him sound like that before. What the hell is going on down here? "I don't know," Hollis admitted. "But whatever it is, Orson knows something about it. He told me he'd seen this before, right before I ran into that thing in the road." They drove back to the station in convoy, Hollis keeping Torres's taillights in view the entire way. The radio stayed quiet except for routine traffic, but Hollis couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. Every time he checked his mirrors, he half expected to see that figure standing in the road behind him, that terrible smile on its too wide mouth. But there was nothing there except empty darkness and the occasional pair of animal eyes reflecting in his headlights. The station was mostly empty when they arrived, just a skeleton crew working the graveyard shift. Orson was waiting for them in his office, sitting behind his desk with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses already poured. That alone was enough to tell Hollis this was serious. Orson was a by-the-book supervisor who never drank on duty, never bent the rules, but here he was offering them alcohol like they were going to need it for what came next. "Sit down, both of you." Orson pushed the glasses across his desk. "And drink. You're going to want it." Hollis and Torres exchanged glances but did as they were told. The whiskey burned going down. Cheap stuff that Orson probably kept in his desk for emergencies. When they'd both finished, Orson poured them each another measure and then leaned back in his chair, studying them with tired eyes. "How much do either of you know about the history of this sector?" Orson asked. "The real history, not the official Border Patrol timeline." "Not much," Torres admitted. Hollis just shook his head. "Back in the 80s, before either of you were born, there was a series of incidents along this stretch of the Rio Grande. Agents disappearing on patrol, bodies found in the river that shouldn't have been there, equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained. The official report said it was cartel violence, smugglers getting more aggressive, but those of us who were here knew better." Orson took a drink straight from the bottle. There was something in the water, something that came and went with the drought cycles, appearing when the river ran low enough to expose certain sections of the riverbed. "What kind of something?" Hollis asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Nobody could say for certain. Some thought it was spirits of people who'd drowned trying to cross. Others believed it was something older, something that had been in the river long before the border existed, before any of us were here. What we did know was that it was dangerous. It could take on different forms, appear as people you knew or strangers who needed help. And if you got too close to the water when it was active, you didn't come back. Orson set down the bottle and fixed them both with a hard stare. "We lost 6 agents in 3 months before someone figured out the pattern. The thing only appeared during certain drought conditions, when the water level dropped below a specific point and exposed this old crossing point that used to be a ford back in the 1800s. Torres was leaning forward now, his skepticism replaced by genuine interest. "So, what did you do? How did you stop it?" "We didn't stop it. We couldn't. But we learned to recognize the signs. When the sensors start acting up, when the water stops moving in certain sections, when thermal reads heat signatures that don't match human patterns, we know it's active again. Standard protocol is to avoid that stretch of river entirely until the water level rises enough to cover the ford again." Orson looked at Hollis. "That's why I told you to get out of there. You stumbled right into an active zone. But why didn't anyone tell us about this?" Hollis felt anger rising alongside his fear. "If this is a known phenomenon, why isn't it in the briefing materials? Why aren't we warned?" "Because officially, it doesn't exist. The incidents from the 80s were classified, buried under layers of bureaucracy. The few of us who remember are told to keep quiet about it, handle it internally when it comes up. The higher-ups think if word got out that Border Patrol was dealing with, hell, I don't even know what to call it, paranormal activity, it would destroy our credibility, make us look like a joke." Orson's expression was bitter. "So we keep our mouths shut, and we lose people every few years when someone new stumbles into a situation they don't understand." Hollis thought about the figure in the road, the way it had dissolved into water. He thought about those footprints that led nowhere, the still surface of the river that reflected the stars like a mirror. And he thought about something else, too, something that had been nagging at him since he'd left the riverbank. "The tracks I found," he said slowly. "They led out of the water, but they didn't go anywhere. Like whoever made them just vanished. But what if they didn't vanish? What if they went somewhere else?" "What do you mean?" Torres asked. "When I was down there, before I saw the things rising from the water, my thermal camera was picking up heat signatures on both sides of the river. On the Mexican side, too. What if whatever this thing is, it's not confined to one side of the border? What if it can cross back and forth at will?" Orson's face went pale. "That would explain some things. We've had reports from Mexican authorities about similar incidents on their side. Federales finding abandoned vehicles near the river. People reporting strange figures in the water. We always assumed it was separate incidents, maybe copycats or drug-related violence. But if it's the same phenomenon..." He trailed off, staring at nothing. "Then it doesn't care about borders," Hollis finished. "It's operating in both countries, using the river as its territory, and when the water gets low enough, it can move more freely." They sat in silence for a moment, digesting this information. Finally, Torres spoke up, his voice uncertain. "So, what do we do? Just avoid that section of river and hope it goes away when the drought ends?" "That's what we've always done," Orson said. "Wait it out. The drought can't last forever. Eventually, the water level will rise and cover the ford again, and whatever's down there will go dormant or move on, or whatever the hell it does when it's not active." "How long does that usually take?" Hollis asked. "Last time, 3 months. But this drought's worse than the one in the 80s. Could take longer." Orson stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the dark desert beyond. "In the meantime, I'm reassigning both of you to different sectors. North of here, away from the active zone. And I'm putting out a notice to all agents to avoid the southern stretch until further notice." "What's the official reason?" Torres asked. "Environmental hazard. Possible chemical contamination in the water. That should be enough to keep people away without raising too many questions." Orson turned back to face them. "And if anyone asks you directly what you saw tonight, you tell them it was a false alarm. Sensor malfunction, nothing more. Understood?" Hollis wanted to argue, wanted to demand that they do something more than just avoid the problem and hope it went away. But he could see the exhaustion in Orson's eyes, the weight of decades of keeping this secret and losing colleagues to something he couldn't explain or fight. So he nodded, accepting the reassignment, and tried to convince himself that staying away from the river would be enough. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about those figures rising from the water, about the handprint pressed into his truck's hood, about the way that thing in the road had smiled at him, as if it knew something he didn't. And most disturbing of all, he couldn't stop thinking about what Orson had said. People who got too close to the water when it was active didn't come back. He wondered how many agents over the years had disappeared into that river. How many bodies had never been found. How many families had been told their loved ones had died in the line of duty without ever learning the truth about what had taken them. The thought made him sick, but it also made him angry. This thing, whatever it was, had been hunting Border Patrol agents for decades, and nobody was doing anything about it except avoiding the problem and hoping it would solve itself. Hollis knew he should let it go. He'd been reassigned to a safe sector, away from the danger zone. He could put this behind him and go back to his normal patrols, pretend none of it had happened. But there was a part of him that couldn't accept that. A stubborn, maybe stupid part that needed to understand what he'd seen, that needed to find some way to fight back. 2 days later, he was at a local bar trying to unwind when he met Maybelline Stroud. She was a river guide, someone who made her living taking tourists on rafting trips down the Rio Grande during the wetter months. She'd been guiding on the river for 15 years, knew every bend and rapid, every shallow and deep spot. And when Hollis mentioned in passing that he worked Border Patrol on the southern sector, her expression changed. "You work the stretch between Del Rio and Eagle Pass?" she asked, setting down her beer. "Down where the old ford is?" Hollis felt his pulse quicken. "You know about the ford? Everyone who works the river knows about it. We stay away from that section, especially during drought years." Maybelline leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "There's something wrong with that part of the river. Has been for as long as I can remember. My grandfather used to guide down there back in the day, before they closed that section to commercial traffic. He told me stories about things he saw in the water, things that looked like people but weren't." "What kind of things?" Hollis kept his voice casual, not wanting to reveal how interested he really was. "He called them the drowned ones. Said they were spirits of people who'd tried to cross the river over the years and didn't make it. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all trapped in the water somehow. During droughts, when the old ford gets exposed, they can manifest more strongly, take on physical form." Maybelline studied his face, and something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was saying. "You've seen them, haven't you? That's why you're asking." Hollis hesitated, then nodded. "A few nights ago, down by the ford, one of them appeared in the road in front of my truck. Put a handprint in the hood that dented the metal." "Jesus," Maybelline breathed. "You're lucky you got away. My grandfather said they sometimes try to lure people into the water, appear as someone who needs help, someone in distress. And if you go in after them," she shook her head, "you don't come back out, not alive anyway, and sometimes not at all. Your grandfather ever figure out how to stop them, how to make them go away?" "He didn't think you could. Said they were part of the river now, woven into it somehow. The only thing you could do was respect their territory, stay away when they were active. But he also said—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "He said there was an old crossing marker somewhere down there. A stone cairn that the original settlers built to mark the ford. He thought maybe if someone removed it, destroyed it, it might break whatever connection these things had to that spot. Did he ever try?" No. He was too afraid of what might happen. Afraid that making them angry might be worse than just leaving them alone. Mabeline finished her beer and stood up. Look, I don't know what you're thinking, but if it involves going back to that ford, don't. These things are dangerous. They've taken too many people already. Don't add yourself to the list. But even as she said it, Hollis knew he was going to ignore her advice, because somewhere in that stretch of river was a stone cairn that might be the key to stopping these manifestations. And if there was even a chance he could end this, could prevent other agents from disappearing into the water, he had to try. Even if it meant going back to the one place Orson had ordered him to avoid. Hollis waited 3 days before making his move. 3 days of working his new sector north of the station, acting like everything was normal while his mind kept circling back to what Mabeline had told him about the stone cairn. He knew going back to the ford was stupid, possibly suicidal, but the alternative was accepting that this thing would keep claiming victims indefinitely. That more agents would disappear, more families would get vague explanations about line-of-duty deaths, and nothing would change because everyone was too afraid to confront the problem directly. On the 4th night, he told the station he was taking a personal day. He packed his truck with everything he thought he might need. Extra flashlights, batteries, rope, a crowbar in case the cairn was too heavy to move by hand. He also brought his service weapon, though he had no illusions about what good it would do against something that could dissolve into water. But it made him feel slightly less helpless, and right now he needed whatever comfort he could get. He drove south just after sunset, timing his arrival at the ford for full darkness. The logic was simple. If these things were most active at night, then that's when he needed to be there to find what he was looking for. The thermal signatures and manifestations only appeared after dark, which meant that's when the connection between the drowned ones and the physical world was strongest. If the cairn was somehow anchoring them to this spot, he'd need to locate it when that anchor was most visible. The drive felt longer than it should have, every mile stretching out as his anxiety built. He kept the radio off, not wanting to hear if anyone from the station tried to call him back. His phone was in the glove compartment, deliberately out of reach. He'd committed to this course of action, and he couldn't let himself second-guess it now. The only way forward was through. When he reached the observation point near the ford, Hollis killed his headlights and sat in the darkness for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The night was clear again, the stars so bright they cast faint shadows across the desert landscape. The Rio Grande stretched away to the south, a dark ribbon cutting through the lighter ground on either side. From this distance it looked peaceful, even beautiful. But Hollis knew better now. He knew what waited in those waters. He grabbed his gear and started down toward the riverbank, moving slowly and carefully in the darkness. His flashlight stayed off for now. He didn't want to announce his presence any sooner than necessary. The thermal camera at his belt was already beeping softly, picking up signatures along the water's edge, but he ignored it. He knew they were there. That was the point. The smell hit him first, that same odor of stagnant water and decay he'd noticed during his last visit. It was stronger now, thick enough to make his eyes water. As he got closer to the river, he could see the water's surface gleaming in the starlight, and just like before, it was perfectly still. No current, no ripples, just that glassy smoothness that shouldn't exist in a flowing river. The sight of it made his stomach clench, but he forced himself to keep moving. He needed to find the cairn, and according to Mabeline, it should be somewhere near the old ford crossing. That meant somewhere in the shallows where the water was lowest, probably partially exposed by the drought. Hollis clicked on his flashlight and began searching, playing the beam along the riverbank and across the exposed sections of riverbed. At first he saw nothing but mud and rocks, the occasional piece of driftwood or trash that had washed up during higher water levels. Then his light caught something different. About 20 yards downstream, There was a formation of stones that didn't match the surrounding geology. They were stacked deliberately, arranged in a rough pyramid maybe 3 feet high, and they were covered in a layer of dried algae and river mud that suggested they'd been underwater until recently. Hollis approached carefully, watching his footing on the slick riverbank. As he got closer, he could see that the stones weren't just stacked randomly. They'd been fitted together with surprising precision. Each rock chosen for its shape and size to create a stable structure that had survived God knew how many floods and droughts. This was it. The cairn Maybelline's grandfather had mentioned. It had to be. Hollis set down his gear and examined the structure more closely. Some of the stones had markings on them, symbols that might have been Spanish or possibly older, carved by whoever had first established this crossing point. The cairn was positioned exactly at the center of the ford, right where the water would be shallowest during normal conditions. Looking at it, Hollis could understand why someone might think it was an anchor point. It had that sense of permanence, of marking something important, the way gravestones mark the dead. He was reaching for the crowbar when the water began to move. It started slowly, subtle ripples spreading outward from points all along the river's edge. Then the ripples became waves, small at first but growing larger, moving against the current, or what should have been the current. And beneath the waves, Hollis could see shapes beginning to form. Dark masses rising from the depths, reaching upward toward the surface. He took a step back from the cairn, his hand dropping to his sidearm, even though he knew it wouldn't help. The first figure broke the surface about 10 feet from where he stood. It rose smoothly, water streaming off its form, and stood in the shallows staring at him with eyes that reflected his flashlight beam. It was shaped like a person, vaguely female, but the details were all wrong. The proportions were too fluid, constantly shifting as if the thing couldn't quite hold a stable form, and it was translucent, almost transparent in places, so he could see the riverbed through its legs and torso. More figures were emerging now, rising from the water all along the ford. Dozens of them, maybe more, all turning to face him with that same empty stare. They didn't move closer, didn't make any threatening gestures. They just stood there in the shallows, watching, waiting. And Hollis realized with a sick jolt that they were between him and his truck. He'd walked right into their territory, and now they had him surrounded. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, feeling foolish even as the words left his mouth. "What did you say to things that had drowned in this river years or decades ago? How did you negotiate with the dead? I just want to understand. I want to know if there's a way to help you move on." The figures didn't respond, didn't move. They just kept staring with those empty, reflecting eyes. But the water around them began to churn more violently, waves lapping up onto the bank with increasing force. And through the sound of the water, Hollis heard something else. Voices, faint and distorted, coming from the figures themselves or from the river around them. They were speaking, all of them at once, creating a cacophony of sound that hurt his ears and made his head pound. He couldn't make out individual words at first. The voices were layered too thickly, overlapping and interfering with each other. But as he listened, patterns began to emerge. Some of the voices were speaking Spanish, others English, and some in languages he didn't recognize at all. They were all saying different things, telling different stories, but the emotional content was the same across all of them. Fear, desperation, the moment of drowning. These were the final thoughts of everyone who died in this river, preserved somehow in the water itself, unable to move on. And they were all looking at him, these drowned voices, as if hoping he could free them. As if the simple act of his presence here, of his acknowledgement, might be enough to release them from whatever held them to this place. The weight of that expectation was crushing, and Hollis felt his resolve waver. How was he supposed to help them? What could one person do against decades or centuries of accumulated death? His radio crackled to life, making him jump. Through the static came Orson's voice, angry and frightened in equal measure. "Varnell, if you can hear me, get out of there right now. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to leave immediately. That's a direct order." Hollis grabbed the radio, keyed the mic. "How did you know I was here?" "I know you, Hollis. I knew you wouldn't just let this go. I've been monitoring the sector frequencies, waiting for you to do something stupid." Orson's voice was strained. "Please, just listen to me. You can't help them. Nobody can. All you're doing is putting yourself in danger." "There's a cairn here," Hollis said, keeping his eyes on the figures in the water. They hadn't moved closer, but they hadn't backed away either. "A stone marker at the ford. If I destroy it, maybe I can break whatever's keeping them here. Or maybe you'll make things worse. Maybe that cairn is the only thing keeping them contained to this section of river. You destroy it, and who knows what happens. They could spread, Hollis. They could claim the entire length of the Rio Grande." Orson paused. "I've lost too many people to this thing over the years. I'm not losing you, too. Please, just come back to the station and we'll figure something else out." Hollis wanted to believe him. Wanted to think there was another solution that didn't involve him standing in the dark, surrounded by drowned spirits while trying to decide whether to destroy the one landmark that might be controlling them. But he'd seen the way these things operated. They weren't contained. They'd already appeared in the road, had followed him away from the river. The cairn wasn't keeping them locked up. It was anchoring them, giving them a focal point to manifest around. "I'm sorry, Orson," he said, "but I have to try." He dropped the radio and picked up the crowbar, approaching the cairn again. The figures in the water began to move, gliding forward through the shallows with that same unnatural fluidity. They were converging on him, cutting off any route of escape, but they still weren't attacking. They were just watching, waiting to see what he would do. Hollis wedged the crowbar under one of the lower stones and levered upward. The rock came free with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting to be moved, and he tossed it aside into the river. The moment the stone hit the water, everything changed. The figures froze in place, their forms becoming more solid, more defined. The voices that had been a constant murmur suddenly rose to a scream, hundreds of mouths opening in unison to release a sound of pure anguish. And the water, that still glassy surface that had been wrong from the beginning, erupted into chaos. Waves crashed against the banks, spray flying high enough to catch the starlight, and the current returned with a vengeance, flowing fast and violent as if years of blocked water were suddenly released. Hollis stumbled back from the cairn, shielding his face from the spray. The figures in the water were changing too, their translucent forms taking on more substance, more detail. He could see their faces now, really see them, and each one was different. Men and women, children and elderly, all frozen in expressions of terror and pain. And they were reaching toward him, dozens of hands stretching out across the water, grasping for something they couldn't quite touch. He realized what he'd done. He hadn't freed them. He'd made them more present, more real, more capable of interacting with the physical world. The cairn hadn't been an anchor. It had been a seal, a barrier keeping them from fully manifesting. And he'd just broken it. "No, no," he muttered, grabbing for another stone, thinking maybe if he put it back, if he rebuilt the cairn, he could undo what he'd started. But the moment his hand touched the next rock, the figures surged forward. They moved through the water like it wasn't there, gliding across the surface and up onto the bank, surrounding him completely. Their hands reached for him, cold and wet and solid enough now to grab hold of his clothes, his arms, his legs. The cold was shocking, a bone-deep chill that seemed to freeze his blood in his veins. Hollis tried to pull away, tried to break free, but there were too many of them and they were too strong. They were dragging him toward the water, step by step, their grip tightening with every moment. And through the screaming chaos of voices, he heard one sound rise above the rest. Laughter, high and manic and terrible, coming from somewhere deeper in the river, from whatever had been controlling these manifestations all along. He'd been wrong about everything. These weren't just spirits of the drowned. They were puppets, controlled by something else. Something that had been using them as bait all along. And now it had what it wanted. Another victim to add to its collection. Hollis's feet hit the water and the cold intensified, spreading through his body like fire. He opened his mouth to scream, and water rushed in, filling his lungs with that same stagnant, rotten taste. The figures pulled him under, down into darkness deeper than the Rio Grande should have been, and the last thing he heard before everything went black was that laughter, echoing through the water like a promise. Hollis woke up coughing water, his lungs burning as he tried to expel the liquid that had filled them. He was lying on his side on something hard and rough, gravel or riverbed, and every breath felt like dragging broken glass through his chest. His vision was blurred, dark shapes moving at the edges that he couldn't quite focus on. For a moment, he thought he was still underwater, still being dragged down by those cold hands. But then his vision cleared enough to see stars overhead and he realized he was on the surface again. But something was wrong. The stars were too bright, too close, as if the atmosphere between him and them had thinned somehow. And the air tasted strange, metallic, and bitter on his tongue. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his head, sharp and intense enough to make his vision white out for a second. When it cleared, he was looking at the Rio Grande, except it wasn't the Rio Grande he knew. The water was black, not the dark blue of nighttime river water, but genuinely black, like oil or tar. It moved sluggishly, thick and viscous, and the surface was covered with a thin film that caught the starlight in iridescent patterns. The smell was overwhelming now, that rot and decay amplified 100-fold until it was almost a physical presence pressing against him. And the river was wider than it should have been, stretching away into darkness on both sides farther than he could see. Hollis struggled to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. His clothes were soaked through, heavy with that black water, and when he looked down at himself he saw that the liquid wasn't just water anymore. It had left stains on his skin, dark marks that looked almost like bruises, but were too uniform, too deliberate. They formed patterns, he realized with growing horror. The same kind of symbols he'd seen carved into the stones of the cairn, now written on his flesh in whatever substance this river had become. "You're not on your side anymore," a voice said behind him. Hollis spun around, nearly losing his balance on the slick stones. Standing a few feet away was a figure that looked human at first glance, but the details were all wrong. It wore clothes from a different era, rough woven fabric and hand-stitched leather that might have been frontier attire from the 1800s. Its face was weathered and lined, but the eyes were that same reflective quality he'd seen in the drowned ones, catching light that shouldn't be reaching them. "Where am I?" Hollis managed to ask, his voice coming out as a rasp. "What happened?" "You crossed over," the figure said. "Broke the seal and fell through. This is the between place, where the drowned wait." It gestured toward the Black River. "You can see it now like we do. Not the Rio Grande as it exists in your world, but as it exists here. All the death that's soaked into it over the years, all the suffering. This is what it really is." Hollis looked at the river again and saw that the figure was right. There were shapes in the water now, hundreds of them, bodies floating just beneath that oily surface. Some were fresh, recently drowned, while others had been there so long they were little more than skeletons held together by scraps of clothing and the black water itself. And they were all aware, all conscious. He could see their eyes moving, following him as he stood on the bank, and he understood with sickening clarity that these people hadn't truly died. They'd been trapped here, kept in a state between life and death, for as long as they'd been in the water. How do I get back? His voice was steadier now, the shock giving way to a desperate need to escape this place. There has to be a way back to my side. There is, the figure said. Same way you came, through the ford, when someone on the other side calls to you. But that requires someone to know you're here, someone to care enough to come looking. It tilted its head in that same disturbing way the other manifestations had. How long do you think it will be before they give up searching? Before they decide you drowned like all the others? Hollis thought about Orson, about the way his supervisor had tried to warn him away from this place. Would he come back to the ford looking for him? Or would he simply file a report, add Hollis's name to the list of agents lost to the river, and tell everyone to stay away from the active zone? The bitter truth was that Hollis had acted against direct orders. He'd gone to the ford knowing it was dangerous, and now he was paying the price. Orson would be angry, would feel guilty, but he wouldn't come looking. Not here, not in this place between places. You said I'm not on my side anymore, Hollis said slowly, working through the implications. But I can see this side now. Does that mean I can also see my side? Can I cross back and forth? The figure smiled, and the expression was hungry. Clever. Yes, you could cross back. The seal is broken now, thanks to you. The barrier between there and here is thin enough that someone who's walked both sides can pass through at will. But there's a cost. It stepped closer, and Hollis could smell the river on it. That rot and decay concentrated into something almost solid. Every time you cross, you bring a piece of this place with you, and every time you return here, you leave a piece of yourself behind. Eventually, there won't be enough of you left to remember which side you belong to. So, I'm trapped here, Hollis said. It wasn't a question. Not trapped, changed. You're one of us now. Whether you want to be or not, the river has claimed you. The figure gestured back toward the black water. But you don't have to suffer like they do. The ones who drowned in fear and pain, they're stuck in that moment forever, reliving it again and again. You went under knowing what you were doing, trying to help. That gives you more control, more awareness. You can choose what you become in this place. Hollis wanted to reject everything the figure was saying, wanted to believe this was a nightmare he'd wake up from. But the pain in his lungs was too real, the smell of the river too intense, the weight of those marks on his skin too present. This was happening. He was here on the wrong side of reality, and there was no easy way back. The only question now was what he did with that knowledge. If I can cross between sides, he said carefully, then I could warn people. I could keep other agents away from the ford, make sure no one else ends up here. You could try, the figure agreed, but would they listen? Would they believe you? Or would they think you were mad, traumatized by whatever happened at the river? Would they lock you away for your own safety while the ford remains active and the drowned keep calling? It laughed, a sound like water over stones. You broke the seal, Agent. The ford is more active now than it's been in decades. More people will be drawn here, more will cross over, and all you'll be able to do is watch. The figure turned and walked toward the water, its form becoming less solid with each step until it was just a shadow against the black surface. Then it was gone, dissolved back into the river like it had never been there at all. Hollis stood alone on the bank. shivering despite the fact that the air temperature hadn't changed. He looked down at his hands and saw they were starting to become translucent, the same quality he'd seen in the drowned ones. He was changing already, becoming part of this place whether he wanted to or not. He needed to get back to his side, needed to try, at least, even if the cost was pieces of himself left behind. Hollis waded into the black water, feeling it pull at his legs with that same cold grip, and he thought about his truck parked at the observation point, about Orson at the station, about the world he'd left behind when he'd fallen through the broken seal. He focused on those images, using them as an anchor, and pushed forward into deeper water. The transition was instantaneous and disorienting. One moment, he was in the Black River, surrounded by floating bodies and that overwhelming smell of decay. The next, he was in the Rio Grande as it existed in his world, the water clear and cold and moving with normal current. He surfaced gasping, his lungs filling with air that tasted clean despite the desert dust in it. He could see the bank ahead, the familiar landscape of the observation point, and he swam toward it with desperate strokes. When he crawled out onto solid ground, he was shaking so badly he could barely stand. But he was back. He'd made it across. His truck was still there, parked where he'd left it, and when he checked his watch he saw that only an hour had passed since he'd approached the cairn. An hour on his side, though it had felt like much longer in the between place. Time moved differently there, or maybe it didn't move at all. Maybe that was part of the trap, the way it kept the drowned locked in their moment of death forever. Hollis climbed into his truck and started the engine with shaking hands. He needed to get back to the station, needed to tell Orson what had happened. But as he put the vehicle in gear, he caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror and froze. His reflection was wrong. Not dramatically, not in any way that someone else would immediately notice, but he could see it. His features were slightly off, the proportions subtly altered. His eyes reflected light at the wrong angle, and when he moved, there was a fractional delay, as if his reflection was copying him rather than being him. He remembered what the figure had said. "Every time you cross, you bring a piece of this place with you." He was carrying the between place inside him now, visible in that wrong reflection. And it would get worse every time he crossed back and forth. Eventually, he wouldn't be able to tell which side was real and which was the reflection. The radio crackled to life, Orson's voice cutting through his thoughts. "Varnell, this is Keene. What's your status? I'm showing your GPS signal at the ford. Respond immediately." Hollis picked up the handset, tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat was full of black water again, that same thick substance he'd coughed up on the other side. He retched, and liquid poured from his mouth, splashing onto the dashboard in dark streams. It pooled in the cup holders and ran down into the cracks between seats, and even as he watched, it began to evaporate, leaving behind those same symbols that marked his skin. "Varnell," Orson sounded panicked now. "If you can hear me, get back to the station right now. I'm coming to get you. Just hold on." Hollis wanted to tell him not to come, that the ford was more dangerous now than it had ever been. But every time he tried to speak, more of that black water came up, and he realized with horror that he was still drowning. Even here on his side, in the physical world, his lungs were full of the river from the between place. He was carrying it with him, and it was killing him slowly. He managed to put the truck in gear and started driving north toward the station. But the road kept shifting, the familiar landmarks becoming strange and unfamiliar. Sometimes he was driving on the dirt track he knew, and sometimes he was on something else, a road that existed in the between place overlaid on the real one. He could see both versions at once, and it was getting harder to tell which one he was actually on. Other vehicles appeared in his headlights, Border Patrol trucks that should have been there, and he tried to flag them down for help. But when they got close, He could see through them, could see that they were reflections or echoes from the other side. The agents driving them were drowned ones, spirits trapped in their moment of death, endlessly patrolling a border that didn't exist anymore. He'd driven maybe 5 miles when he saw someone standing in the road ahead. Another figure, solid and real, waving their arms for him to stop. Hollis hit the brakes and the truck skidded to a halt. The figure approached his window, and he saw it was Mabeline, the river guide. She looked terrified, her face pale and her eyes too wide. "I felt something change at the ford," she said, speaking quickly. "Something big. The whole river feels different now. What did you do down there?" "I broke the seal," Hollis managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I destroyed the cairn and I fell through to the other side. Mabeline, it's not just spirits. There's something else down there, something controlling them. And now it's stronger. The barrier is broken." "Jesus Christ." Mabeline backed away from the truck, shaking her head. "You need to get to a hospital. You need help. Look at yourself, Hollis. You're—" She trailed off, staring at him with an expression of horror that told him his appearance was worse than he'd thought. He looked down at his hands and saw they were becoming translucent again, taking on that same quality as the drowned ones. The marks on his skin were glowing faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. And when he looked at Mabeline, he could see 2 versions of her. One standing by his truck in the real world, and another standing in the black water of the between place, already drowned, already claimed by the river. "It's spreading," he said. "Whatever's on the other side, it's bleeding through into this world now. The ford isn't just a place where people drown anymore, it's a doorway. And I opened it." He coughed, and more black water came up. "You need to warn people. Tell them to stay away from the entire southern sector. Tell them—" He didn't get to finish. The pain in his chest intensified, became crushing, and he slumped forward over the steering wheel. His vision was dimming, and he could feel the pull of the between place dragging at him, trying to pull him back through. He fought against it, trying to hold on to consciousness, but it was like fighting the current of a flooding river, overwhelming and inevitable. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing on the bank of the Black River, back on the wrong side. The truck, Mabeline, the desert night, all of it was gone. He'd crossed over again without meaning to, pulled back by the connection he'd formed when he'd first fallen through. And this time, looking down at himself, he could see he'd left more behind. His hands were almost completely transparent now, and the marks on his skin had spread to cover most of his body. The figure from before was standing nearby, watching him with something that might have been sympathy. "It gets easier," it said. "The crossing, the transitions. Eventually, you won't feel the pull at all. You'll just be here, part of the river, like all the rest of us." "How long?" Hollis asked. His voice sounded strange, distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "How long before I'm gone completely?" "That depends on how hard you fight it. Most people, they give up after a few crossings, accept what they've become, and stop trying to go back. But some keep trying, keep crossing back and forth, until there's nothing left of who they were." The figure moved closer. "You could choose to stay here. Accept it now and keep some of yourself intact. Or you can keep fighting, keep trying to warn people, and lose yourself piece by piece until you're just another voice in the water." Hollis thought about Orson, about the other agents who worked the southern sector, about all the people who'd cross the ford in the future, drawn by circumstances or bad luck or simple ignorance into this trap. If he stayed here, gave up, they'd have no warning. No one would know what the broken seal had done, how dangerous the river had become. But if he kept crossing, kept trying to warn people, he'd destroy himself in the process. It wasn't really a choice at all. "I'm going back," he said. The figure nodded slowly. "Then I'll see you again soon, and the time after that, and the time after that, until there's nothing left of Hollis Varnell except another drowned voice calling from the water." Hollis didn't respond. He turned toward the Black River and waded in, focusing on his side, on the world he'd left behind. The crossing was harder this time, the pull of the between place stronger, but he forced his way through and surfaced in the Rio Grande under the stars. He made it to the bank and collapsed, coughing up more of that black water, feeling pieces of himself slipping away with each breath. But he was back, and as long as he could keep crossing, as long as he could hold on to enough of himself to remember why he was doing this, he'd keep trying to warn people, keep trying to prevent others from making the same mistake he had, even if it meant losing himself completely in the process. 3 days later, Orson Keene filed a report about Agent Hollis Varnell. According to the official record, Varnell had disappeared while investigating sensor anomalies near the Rio Grande Ford. His truck was found abandoned at the observation point, his radio still transmitting static, and his service weapon was discovered on the riverbank. Search and rescue operations had been conducted for 72 hours with no results. Agent Varnell was presumed dead, lost to the river. What the report didn't mention was the other sightings, the witnesses who claimed to see Varnell near the ford over the following weeks, sometimes on the Texas side, sometimes appearing on the Mexican side, always with that strange translucent quality, or the radio transmissions that came through on Border Patrol frequencies at night, garbled and distorted but using Varnell's voice, warning agents to stay away from the southern sector, or the fact that Maybelline Stroud had left the area entirely, refusing to guide on the Rio Grande anymore, telling anyone who asked that the river was wrong now, corrupted, and no one should go near it. The ford remained active. The seal stayed broken. And somewhere in the space between this world and the other, Hollis Varnell kept crossing back and forth, getting thinner and more transparent with each transition, holding on to his purpose even as he lost everything else. He'd become exactly what he'd been trying to prevent. Another ghost story along the border. Another warning that no one would heed. And in the black water of the between place, the drowned ones waited, always waiting, growing in number as the broken seal claimed more victims. Patient and hungry and eternal, just like the river itself. The thing about working the Big Bend sector was that you could go days without seeing another human being. The canyons stretched for miles in every direction, carved deep into ancient limestone by rivers that had dried up centuries ago. The border fence here was more suggestion than barrier, broken sections and rusted posts marking where international boundaries supposedly existed. Most smugglers avoided this area entirely. Too remote, too difficult, too easy to get lost and die of exposure before reaching anything resembling civilization. But that remoteness was exactly why Border Patrol maintained a presence here, why agents like Enoch Calder spent their shifts driving dirt roads that barely qualified as roads, watching for the few people desperate or foolish enough to try crossing through the canyons. Enoch had been working Big Bend for 3 years, long enough to know the rhythms of the place. The way the wind changed direction in the late afternoon, carrying smells from miles away. The particular quality of silence that settled over the canyons at night. So complete, it felt like a physical presence. The locations where his radio worked, and where it didn't, blocked by the canyon walls or simply too far from any repeater tower to pick up signal. He'd learned to be comfortable with isolation, with going hours between communications, with making decisions on his own because backup was always at least an hour away and usually longer. Tonight, he was working the Northern Canyon line, a section that followed the edge of a deep gorge for about 15 miles before looping back toward the station. The route took approximately 4 hours to complete, and Enoch was 2 hours in when his radio started acting strange. Not the usual static or dead zones, but something different. The squelch would break randomly, letting through bursts of noise that almost sounded like speech, then cut back to silence before he could make out any words. At first, he thought it was interference from the Mexican side, possibly military communications bleeding over onto Border Patrol frequencies. But the pattern was too irregular, too random. He was trying to adjust his radio when his headlights caught something on the road ahead. A piece of metal lying in the center of the track, reflecting his beams with sharp intensity. Enoch slowed to a stop and grabbed his flashlight, stepping out of the truck to investigate. As he got closer, he recognized what it was. A signal mirror, the kind hikers and backpackers carried for emergency situations. It was old, the metal tarnished and scratched, but still functional. Someone had left it here deliberately, placed it in a spot where anyone driving this route would see it. Enoch picked up the mirror and turned it over in his hands. On the back was a piece of tape with writing, faded but still legible. A name and a date, J. Breslin, March 2023. He knew that name. Breslin had been an agent who'd gone missing about 8 months ago, vanished while on patrol in this same sector. There'd been a massive search operation, helicopters and ground teams combing the canyons for weeks, but they'd never found any trace of him. Eventually, the search was called off and Breslin was declared dead, though no body was ever recovered. So, what was his signal mirror doing here, in the middle of a road he should have been patrolling when he disappeared? Enoch pulled out his radio and keyed the mic. "Station, this is Unit 12. I found some potential evidence related to the Breslin case. Signal mirror with his name on it, located at mile marker 7 on the North Canyon Road. Requesting guidance." The response was immediate but garbled, words breaking up into meaningless fragments. "Unit, zzzt, canyon, zzzt, careful, zzzt." Then silence, the radio going completely dead despite the fact that this spot should have decent reception. Enoch tried again, got nothing but static. He checked his phone and found he had no signal bars either, which was unusual. He typically had at least minimal coverage along this section of road. It was as if all communications had suddenly been cut off, leaving him isolated in a way that went beyond the normal remoteness of the area. The feeling made his skin prickle, a primitive warning that something was wrong, even if he couldn't identify what exactly was triggering that response. He returned to his truck and placed the signal mirror on the passenger seat, then continued driving. But now he was more alert, scanning the road and surrounding terrain with increased attention. The canyons here were deep, their walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, creating shadows even in the bright moonlight. Rock formations jutted out at odd angles, shaped by wind and water into forms that almost looked deliberate, like sculptures or monuments. And everywhere there was that silence, broken only by the sound of his engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. About a mile past where he'd found the mirror, Enoch noticed something else. Cairns, stacked stones marking the edge of the road at regular intervals. They looked old, weathered by years of exposure, but someone had placed them there deliberately. He'd driven this route dozens of times and had never seen them before. They seemed to have appeared overnight, or maybe he'd simply never noticed them until now, his attention drawn by the discovery of Breslin's mirror. He stopped to examine one of the cairns more closely. The stones were local limestone, stacked with surprising precision considering how rough and irregular they were. Each cairn stood about 3 feet high, and they were spaced roughly 50 yards apart, creating a line that paralleled the road. Looking at them gave Enoch the same uneasy feeling as the signal mirror had. They weren't trail markers or survey points. They were something else, serving some purpose he couldn't identify. As he stood there studying the nearest cairn, the wind changed direction. It came from deeper in the canyon, carrying with it a sound that made him freeze. Bells, distant and faint, ringing in no particular rhythm. The sound would rise for a moment, then fade away, then return slightly louder or from a different direction. There were no bells out here, no churches, no ranches close enough for their sounds to carry this far. The nearest settlement was 30 miles away, across terrain that would have blocked any sound from reaching this location. Enoch returned to his truck and grabbed his binoculars, scanning the canyon walls for any sign of where the sound might be coming from. The moonlight was bright enough to see the general landscape, all jagged rocks and sparse vegetation, but he couldn't spot anything that might be creating the noise. The bells continued their irregular pattern, sometimes sounding close enough to be just around the next bend, other times so distant they might have been coming from miles away. And underneath the bells, almost too faint to hear, was something else. A voice, or multiple voices, calling out words he couldn't distinguish. His radio crackled back to life suddenly, making him jump. Through heavy static came a voice that might have been the station dispatcher, but the words were incomprehensible, distorted beyond recognition. The transmission lasted maybe 5 seconds before cutting out again, leaving only dead air. Enoch tried to respond but got no acknowledgement. Whatever had briefly allowed the signal through had closed again, and he was back to being completely isolated. He made a decision then to continue the route but document everything unusual he encountered. If something strange was happening in this sector, if there was some connection to Breslin's disappearance, he needed evidence. He started his truck and drove slowly, keeping his eyes on the cairns that continued to line the road. After another half-mile, the stones ended abruptly at a point where the canyon narrowed, the walls closing in until there was barely enough room for his vehicle to pass through. This was the throat, as the agents called it, a natural choke point where the canyon constricted before opening up again into a wider valley. It was also a dead zone for communications, the rock walls too high and too close to allow any signals in or out. Enoch normally drove through it quickly, uncomfortable with the claustrophobic feeling of having several hundred tons of stone looming overhead. But tonight he took it slow, his headlights revealing something he'd never noticed before. There were markings on the canyon walls, scratched or carved into the limestone at about head height. They ran along both sides of the throat, continuing for maybe 100 yards. The marks weren't words or pictures, just lines and angles that might have been some kind of counting system or calendar. They looked old, the edges worn smooth by wind and time, but they were too deliberate to be natural erosion. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating them, possibly years' worth based on how extensive they were. Enoch stopped the truck in the middle of the throat and got out, playing his flashlight over the markings. Up close, he could see there was a pattern to them. The lines grouped in clusters of varying sizes. 5 marks, then 3, then 7, then 2, repeating in different combinations. It reminded him of something, tickled at a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Then it hit him. Morse code. The pattern wasn't random. Someone had carved a message into the canyon walls using long and short marks to represent dots and dashes. He pulled out his phone and started documenting the marks, taking photos even though he had no signal to send them anywhere. It took him almost 20 minutes to photograph the entire sequence, moving deeper into the throat as he worked. By the time he finished, he'd walked almost to the far end, leaving his truck back near the entrance. That was when he heard the bells again, much louder now, echoing off the canyon walls with enough volume to make his ears ring. The sound was coming from ahead, from the wider valley beyond the throat. Enoch moved forward cautiously, his hand resting on his sidearm, even though he had no idea what good it would do against whatever was making that noise. The throat opened up suddenly, and he found himself standing at the edge of a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by canyon walls on 3 sides. And there, in the center of the bowl, was a structure. It looked like it might have been a line shack once, one of those small shelters that ranchers built in remote areas to use during cattle drives. But it had been modified extensively, expanded with materials that didn't match the original construction. Corrugated metal sheets, weathered wood planks, and sections of what looked like old vehicle panels had been added to the structure, creating something that was half building and half sculpture. And hanging from every available surface were bells, dozens of them, ranging from small hand bells to larger cowbells, all suspended on wires or chains so they'd move in the slightest breeze. The wind gusted through the amphitheater, and all the bells rang at once, creating a cacophony that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Enoch covered his ears, the sound physically painful in its intensity, and watched as the structure seemed to vibrate from the noise. When the wind died down and the bells fell silent, he cautiously approached, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal more details. The walls of the structure were covered in the same kind of markings he'd seen in the throat, but these were more elaborate, more densely packed. They covered every surface, even the bells themselves, creating a maze of lines and angles that hurt to look at for too long. And there was something else too, something that made his stomach clench. Articles of clothing, hung from the bells like offerings. Shirts and jackets and hats, all weathered and faded, but still recognizable as Border Patrol uniforms. Enoch moved closer, examining the clothing items. Some were so old they were falling apart, probably dating back decades. Others looked newer, including one jacket that still had a name tape attached. Breslin. The missing agent's jacket, hanging here in this impossible structure in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by bells and markings and the uniforms of God knew how many other agents who'd disappeared over the years. His radio exploded into static so loud it hurt his ears even through the speaker. He grabbed for the volume knob, trying to turn it down, and that's when he heard it. Through the static, clear as day, was a voice. Breslin's voice. He'd heard it enough times in briefings and casual conversation to recognize it. The voice was saying something, repeating the same phrase over and over, but distorted and echoing as if coming from very far away or very deep underground. Line of sight. Lost the line. Can't find the line. Enoch keyed his mic with shaking hands. Breslin? Agent Breslin, is that you? What's your location? The static intensified, became almost unbearable, and then cut off completely. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. Enoch stood there in the dark, surrounded by bells and uniforms and impossible markings, and felt the weight of the canyon pressing down on him. Something was very wrong in this sector, had been wrong for a long time, and he just walked right into the middle of it. A sound behind him made him spin around, his hand going to his weapon. But there was nothing there, just empty darkness and the faint outline of the throat where he'd left his truck. Except his truck wasn't where he'd left it. The entrance to the amphitheater was empty. No vehicle visible, no headlights cutting through the night. His truck had vanished, or he'd somehow walked much farther than he'd thought, and now he was stranded here with no transportation and no communications. The bells began to ring again, but this time there was no wind. They moved on their own, swaying and chiming in a rhythm that was almost musical, almost deliberate. And in that rhythm, Enoch could hear something else. Voices, multiple voices layered over each other, all saying the same thing Breslin had said. Lost the line. Can't find the line. Line of sight. He backed away from the structure, his heart hammering in his chest, and turned to run back toward where he thought the throat had been. But the landscape had changed. The canyon walls weren't where they should be, and the ground beneath his feet felt wrong, too soft and too unstable. He was still in the amphitheater, still surrounded by those ringing bells, but the space had somehow gotten larger, stretched out in impossible ways. And standing at the edge of his flashlight beam, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. Tall and thin, wearing what might have been a Border Patrol uniform, it stood perfectly still despite the chaos of the bells around it. Enoch raised his flashlight, trying to get a better look at the person's face, and immediately wished he hadn't. It was Breslin, or something wearing Breslin's face. But the features were wrong, the proportions slightly off, as if someone had tried to recreate a human being from memory and gotten the details just close enough to be recognizable, but far enough off to be disturbing. The figure's eyes didn't blink, didn't reflect the flashlight beam, just stared at Enoch with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Lost the line," the figure said, its voice a perfect imitation of Breslin's, but somehow hollow, empty of any real emotion. "Can't find the line of sight. The canyon took it. The canyon takes everything." Enoch wanted to run, wanted to get away from this thing and this place, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, transfixed by that terrible stare, while the bells rang louder and louder around him. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness between one heartbeat and the next. The moment it was gone, Enoch found he could move again, and he ran. He had no idea which direction he was going, just knew he needed to get away from the structure and those bells and whatever that thing had been. The canyon walls seemed to shift around him as he ran, passages opening and closing in ways that defied the laws of physics. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, and then he collapsed against a rock face, gasping for air and trying to figure out where he was. When he finally caught his breath and looked up, he saw his truck. It was parked maybe 50 yards away, sitting exactly where he'd left it at the entrance to the throat. Enoch staggered to his feet and stumbled toward the vehicle, not trusting his eyes, but not caring as long as it meant escape. He threw himself into the driver's seat and started the engine, and only then did he notice what was sitting on his dashboard. A bell, small and tarnished, just like the ones that had hung from that structure. It sat there innocently, and as he stared at it, it began to ring softly, moved by vibrations from the engine. The sound filled the cab of his truck, impossibly loud for such a small bell, and Enoch knew with sick certainty that he'd brought something back with him from that place. Something that wasn't finished with him yet. Enoch didn't go back to the station that night. He drove to the nearest overlook, a spot about 10 miles from the amphitheater where the road widened enough to park safely, and he sat there until dawn with the engine running and all the doors locked. The bell on his dashboard had stopped ringing once he'd left the canyon, falling silent in a way that was somehow more disturbing than the sound had been. It just sat there, innocuous and tarnished, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. Every time he looked at it, he remembered that structure with its dozens of bells and the uniforms of missing agents hanging like prayers to something that shouldn't exist. When the sun finally rose, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, Enoch felt some of the tension drain from his body. Daylight made everything seem more manageable, more real. He could almost convince himself that what he'd experienced had been some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination, stress and isolation playing tricks on his mind. Almost, but not quite. The bell was still there, solid evidence that something had happened, and his phone was still full of photos of those markings carved into the canyon walls. He picked up his radio, found it working normally now that he was out of the canyons, and called the station. The dispatcher answered immediately, her voice tinged with concern. "Unit 12, we've been trying to reach you for hours. What's your status?" "I'm fine," Enoch said, though that was a lie. "Had some equipment issues in the canyon. Lost communications for most of the night. I need to speak with the supervisor when I get back. Found some evidence related to the Breslin case." There was a pause on the other end. "Copy that. Supervisor wants you to come in immediately for debriefing. And Enoch, there's someone here who wants to talk to you. Park liaison from Big Bend National Park. She's been asking about unusual activity in the border canyons." That was interesting. The National Park Service and Border Patrol had an uneasy relationship in this sector, their jurisdictions overlapping in ways that created constant territorial disputes. For a park liaison to be at the Border Patrol station asking about canyon activity suggested something significant had happened. Enoch acknowledged the message and started driving back, keeping his speed moderate on the rough roads. The bell stayed silent on his dashboard, but he could feel its presence, a weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass. The station was a low-slung building that looked like it had been there since the 1950s, all concrete block and narrow windows designed to keep out the desert heat. Enoch pulled into the lot and sat in his truck for a moment, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. He had no idea how much to tell them about what he'd seen. The truth sounded insane even to him, and he'd been there. But the bell was real, the signal mirror was real, and those photos on his phone were real. Whatever was happening in the canyons, it had been going on long enough to claim multiple agents, and someone needed to take it seriously. He grabbed the signal mirror and left the bell where it was, not wanting to bring it inside but also afraid to throw it away. The station's interior was cool and dim after the bright morning sun, the air conditioning working overtime to combat the growing heat. His supervisor, a career agent named Ramirez, was waiting for him in the conference room along with a woman Enoch had never seen before. She was in her late 40s, with sun-weathered skin and gray streaking through her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore the standard National Park Service uniform, and her name tag identified her as Laura Lee Huxford. When Enoch entered, she stood and extended her hand, her grip firm and her eyes sharp as they studied his face. "Agent Calder," she said. "I'm the Cultural Resources Liaison for Big Bend National Park. I understand you had an unusual experience in the border canyons last night." "News travels fast," Enoch said, taking a seat at the table. He set down Breslin's signal mirror, and both Ramirez and Laura Lee leaned forward to examine it. "Jesus," Ramirez breathed. "That's definitely Breslin's. Where did you find it?" "Mile marker 7 on the North Canyon route, just sitting in the middle of the road like someone had placed it there deliberately." Enoch pulled out his phone and showed them the photos of the markings in the throat. "And these were carved into the canyon walls. They look like Morse code, but I haven't had time to translate them yet." Laura Lee studied the photos with intense interest, zooming in on details and swiping through the images multiple times. "These aren't new," she said finally. "We've documented similar markings throughout the park, dating back at least 100 years. We've always assumed they were created by early settlers or surveyors, but we've never been able to definitively translate them." She looked up at Enoch. "Where exactly did you find these? Which canyon?" "The throat section, just before it opens into the valley." "Why? Have you seen markings like this in other locations?" "Several. Always in narrow sections of canyon, places where the walls close in and create natural choke points." Laura Lee pulled out her own phone and showed him photos that looked remarkably similar to what he'd documented. "We've recorded them in at least 15 different locations throughout the park. They all share certain characteristics, the same type of marking pattern, always at about head height, always concentrated in areas with limited sight lines." "Limited sight lines," Enoch repeated, remembering what the Breslin figure had said. "Lost the line of sight. That's what I heard on the radio last night, coming from what sounded like Breslin's voice." Ramirez's expression darkened. Explain that. You're saying you heard Breslin on the radio 8 months after he disappeared? Enoch nodded and told them everything, starting with finding the signal mirror and ending with waking up to find his truck exactly where he'd left it, but with the bell on his dashboard. He left nothing out, even the parts that sounded impossible, and watched their faces for signs of disbelief. Ramirez looked skeptical but concerned. Laura Lee, however, looked like she'd been expecting something like this. "The structure you described," Laura Lee said when he finished. "The one with all the bells and the uniforms. I think I know where it is. We've had hikers report seeing something similar about 3 miles deeper into the park, past where the border fence ends. They describe it as some kind of abandoned shelter that's been modified with found materials. Most people assume it's just a homeless camp or maybe something left over from smuggling operations. But everyone who's seen it says there's something wrong about it, something that makes them want to leave immediately." "Have you investigated it?" Enoch asked. "We've tried, sent rangers out to document it, but they can never seem to find it twice in the same place. The coordinates change, or the landscape looks different, or they just get turned around in the canyons and end up somewhere else entirely." Laura Lee's voice had taken on a frustrated edge. "It's like the structure moves, or like it only appears under certain conditions. We've started calling it the Bell House, and it's become something of an unofficial legend among park staff." "What about the bells themselves?" Enoch thought about the small bell sitting in his truck. "Is there any significance to them? Some cultural or historical reason why they'd be there?" Laura Lee was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "There's an old story passed down from the ranching families who used to work this area before it became a park. They talked about something called the Echo Keeper, a phenomenon or entity that supposedly lived in the deepest canyons. According to the legend, the Echo Keeper would trap sounds, preserve them somehow, and repeat them back at unexpected times. Bells were supposedly used as a warning system, a way to know if the Echo Keeper was active in a particular area. If you heard bells ringing with no wind, you were supposed to leave immediately. That's just folklore, though," Ramirez said. But he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Superstition from people who didn't understand how sound works in canyon systems." "Maybe," Laura Lee agreed. "But folklore usually has roots in real experiences, real events that people couldn't explain with the knowledge they had at the time. And there's documented evidence that something unusual happens in those canyons. We've had multiple instances of equipment failure, communication disruptions, even GPS devices giving impossible readings. The Park Service officially attributes it to magnetic anomalies in the rock formations, but that doesn't explain everything." Enoch thought about the way the canyon had seemed to shift around him, passages opening and closing in ways that defied normal geography. What if it's not just magnetic anomalies? What if there's something about the canyons themselves, the way they're structured, that creates some kind of spatial distortion? Like a natural phenomenon we don't have the science to explain yet? "That's one theory," Laura Lee said. "There's another one I've heard from some of the older park rangers, the ones who've been working this area for decades. They think the canyons are alive in some sense. Not literally, not biologically, but that they have properties we'd normally associate with living things. Memory, awareness, response to stimuli. And if that's true, then maybe what happened to Agent Breslin and the others wasn't random. Maybe the canyons took them deliberately." The room fell silent. The idea was absurd. The kind of thing that belonged in a bad horror movie rather than a serious discussion between law enforcement and Park Service personnel. But Enoch couldn't shake the memory of that Breslin figure, the way it had moved and spoken with such uncanny precision, or the way his truck had vanished and reappeared, or the bell that had materialized on his dashboard without him placing it there. "I want to go back," he said, suddenly, "with proper equipment and backup." I want to document that structure, translate those markings, figure out what's really happening in those canyons. If there's even a chance we can find out what happened to Breslin and the others, we have to try." Ramirez shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. You're off the canyon routes until we figure this out. I'm not sending anyone back there without a better understanding of what we're dealing with." "Then how are we supposed to get that understanding?" Enoch challenged. "By ignoring it? By hoping it goes away on its own? Because that's what we've been doing for years, apparently, and people keep disappearing." "He's right," Laura Lee said. "I can organize a joint operation. Border Patrol and Park Service working together. We bring in specialists, maybe some researchers from the university who study acoustic phenomena and spatial perception. We approach this scientifically, document everything, and see if we can find rational explanations." "And if we can't find rational explanations?" Ramirez asked. "Then at least we'll know what we're dealing with," Laura Lee replied, "which is more than we know now." After considerable debate, they agreed to organize an expedition for the following week. It would be small, just 4 people: Enoch, Laura Lee, a park ranger with extensive canyon experience, and Ramirez himself, who insisted on coming along to supervise. They'd bring communication equipment, GPS trackers, cameras, and everything else they could think of to document what they found. The plan was to enter the canyons at dawn, locate the Bell House if possible, and be back out before dark. Simple, straightforward, nothing that should go wrong. But Enoch couldn't shake the feeling that the canyons wouldn't let them go that easily. That by planning to return, by actively seeking out the Bell House and whatever resided there, they were doing exactly what something wanted them to do. The thought kept him awake for the next several nights, lying in bed and listening to the desert wind outside his window, half expecting to hear bells ringing in the distance. On the 3rd night after his encounter, Enoch was woken by a sound. Not bells, but his radio, sitting on his nightstand and crackling with static despite being turned off. He grabbed it, and the static resolved into a voice. Not Breslin this time, but someone else. A woman's voice, older, speaking with an accent that sounded like it belonged to a different era. "The line must be maintained," the voice said. "The line of sight keeps them contained. Break the line, and they escape. Mark the line, and they know where to hunt. The bells remember everything. Everything." "Who is this?" Enoch demanded, but the only response was more static. Then, cutting through the noise, he heard bells. The same irregular pattern he'd heard in the amphitheater, dozens of bells ringing in chaotic harmony. The sound grew louder, filling his bedroom, and Enoch stumbled out of bed and away from the radio. But the sound didn't come from the radio anymore. It came from outside, from the desert beyond his window. He pulled back the curtain and looked out into the darkness. There, standing in the middle of the empty lot behind his apartment, was a figure. Even in the dim light from the street lamps, he could see it was wearing a Border Patrol uniform. It stood perfectly still, and hanging from its belt and shoulders were bells, dozens of small bells that swayed and rang despite the fact that there was no wind. The figure raised one hand and pointed at Enoch's window, at him specifically as if it could see him through the glass and the darkness. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the desert, and the bells faded with it until there was only silence again. Enoch checked his phone and found a text message from an unknown number. It had been sent at the exact moment he'd seen the figure pointing at him. The message contained no words, just a photo of the Bell House taken from inside looking out, and in the doorway stood a silhouette that might have been a person. The image was grainy and dark, but Enoch could make out enough detail to see that the silhouette was wearing his uniform, his badge, his equipment. It was him, or something that looked like him, already waiting at the Bell House for his arrival. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night, just sat at his kitchen table, staring at that photo and wondering if going back to the canyons was a rescue mission or a trap. Wondering if he'd already crossed some invisible line that meant there was no going back, no matter what choice he made. And wondering how many other agents over the years had received similar messages, similar warnings, and gone into the canyons anyway because they thought they could solve the mystery. How many of them had ever come back out? The expedition was scheduled for 5 days from now. 5 days to prepare, to gather equipment, to convince himself this was the right decision. But Enoch had a feeling that 5 days wouldn't be enough, that no amount of time or preparation would be enough for what waited in those canyons. The Bell House wanted them to come. Something in the canyons had been waiting for years, maybe decades, for people to venture deep enough to find it. And now that they were planning to do exactly that, Enoch couldn't escape the certainty that they were making a terrible mistake. The 5 days passed too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Enoch tried to prepare for the expedition, checking and rechecking equipment, studying maps of the canyon system, reviewing everything he knew about Breslin's disappearance. But his attention kept drifting to the bell that still sat on his dashboard, silent and tarnished, and to the photo on his phone that showed his own silhouette waiting at the bell house. Every night he woke to the sound of bells in the distance, and twice more he saw figures standing in the desert behind his apartment, always just at the edge of visibility, always wearing Border Patrol uniforms. Laura Lee called him 2 days before the expedition to discuss additional findings. She'd been researching the history of the area, digging through old records and interviewing longtime residents. What she'd discovered wasn't comforting. The Bell House, or structures like it, had been reported as far back as the 1890s. Early ranchers and prospectors had written about finding strange shelters in the canyons, always decorated with bells and always abandoned but looking recently occupied. Some of the accounts mentioned seeing figures in the distance that disappeared when approached. Others talked about hearing voices echoing through the canyons, speaking in languages that shouldn't exist in this part of the world. "There's a pattern," Laura Lee said over the phone, her voice tight with tension. Every few decades, there's a cluster of disappearances in the canyons. Sometimes it's miners, sometimes ranchers, sometimes hikers, and now it's Border Patrol agents. The intervals vary, but it always happens when the canyons are being used heavily, when there's a lot of human traffic through the area. "You think whatever's in there is territorial?" Enoch asked. "That it takes people who intrude on its space?" "I think it's more deliberate than that. The disappearances aren't random. They always involve people who are alone, people who've gone deeper into the canyons than they should have, people who've seen or heard something that made them curious enough to investigate. It's selective. It's hunting specific prey. Then we're walking right into a trap by going back there." "Maybe," Laura Lee admitted. "But we're going in prepared this time. We know what to look for. We'll have constant communication and we're not going alone. 4 people together have better odds than 1 person isolated in the canyons." Enoch wanted to believe that, but he kept thinking about the photo on his phone. If something in the canyons could already place his image at the Bell House before he'd even arrived, then it knew they were coming. It was expecting them. And whatever advantages they thought they had, superior numbers and preparation and communication equipment, might not mean anything against something that could manipulate space and time in ways they didn't understand. On the morning of the expedition, Enoch met the others at the station just before dawn. Ramirez looked tired but determined, wearing field gear he probably hadn't used in years. Laura Lee had brought a Park Service ranger named Boaz Kestrel, a man in his 60s with decades of experience in the canyons. Boaz had a weathered face and calm eyes that suggested he'd seen things that didn't make it into official reports. When Enoch shook his hand, the older man held his grip for a moment longer than necessary and spoke quietly. "I heard about your encounter with the Bell House," Boaz said. "I've seen it too, years ago. Lost 2 days trying to find my way back out of the canyons. When I finally made it, my truck was exactly where I'd left it, but my equipment was different. Items I'd been carrying were gone, replaced with things I'd never seen before, old things from different eras. I've got a compass at home that's engraved with a date from 1887, even though I've only had it for 15 years. "Did you ever go back?" Enoch asked. "No, and I never planned to. But I figure if anyone's going to investigate that place properly, I'd better be there to help. I know the canyons better than anyone, and I know the signs to watch for when things start going wrong." Boaz released his grip and stepped back. "Just promise me something. If I tell you we need to leave, we leave. No arguments, no delays. Some knowledge isn't worth the price of obtaining it." They loaded into 2 vehicles, Enoch and Ramirez in one, Laura Lee and Boaz in the other, and drove south toward the canyon line. The plan was simple. Follow the route Enoch had taken the night of his encounter, document the markings in the throat, and then attempt to locate the Bell House using the coordinates from his photos and Boaz's memory of the area. They'd spend no more than 6 hours in the canyons, maintaining constant radio contact, and at the first sign of trouble they'd extract immediately. The drive took 90 minutes, following dirt roads that deteriorated into barely passable tracks the farther they went. By the time they reached the observation point where Enoch had spent that long night, the sun was fully up, and the canyon walls glowed red in the morning light. They parked the vehicles and gathered to review the plan one final time. Everyone carried radios, GPS trackers, cameras, and emergency supplies. Ramirez had insisted they also bring flares and rope, standard search and rescue equipment that might prove useful if they got separated. "Remember," Ramirez said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "we stay together. No one goes off alone for any reason. We document what we find. We don't touch anything we don't have to, and if the situation feels dangerous, we abort. This is a reconnaissance mission, not a rescue operation. Understood?" Everyone nodded, though Enoch caught Boaz and Laura Lee exchanging a glance that suggested they knew it wouldn't be that simple. The canyons didn't operate by normal rules, and whatever waited in them wouldn't respect their careful plans or safety protocols. But they were committed now, and backing out would mean accepting that some mysteries couldn't be solved, that some losses couldn't be explained or avenged. They started down into the canyon, following the route toward the throat. The temperature dropped as they descended, the canyon walls blocking out the direct sunlight and creating a permanent twilight at the bottom. Their footsteps echoed off the stone, and every sound seemed amplified, bouncing back and forth between the walls in a way that made it hard to determine where any noise was actually coming from. Enoch found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, certain he'd heard something behind them, but there was never anything there except shadows and stone. The throat appeared ahead, that narrow passage with its walls covered in carved markings. They stopped at the entrance, and Laura Lee immediately began photographing and documenting the symbols while Boaz stood watch, his expression growing more troubled as he studied the canyon ahead. Enoch noticed the older ranger's hand kept drifting to a small bell attached to his belt, fingers touching it briefly before dropping away. "You brought a bell?" Enoch asked quietly. "Found it in my truck 15 years ago, after my encounter. Figured if these things keep appearing, maybe they serve a purpose beyond just making noise. Maybe they're a form of communication." Boaz looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes. "Have you noticed your bell is still in your truck?" Enoch had. The bell from his first encounter had remained on his dashboard despite his intention to throw it away multiple times. Every time he reached for it, something stopped him. Some instinct that said keeping it was important. He'd started thinking of it as a talisman, though whether it was supposed to protect him or mark him, he couldn't say. The markings here are identical to ones I've documented throughout the park, Laura Lee said, reviewing her photos. But there are additions, newer carvings that overlay the older ones. Look at this. She pointed to a section where the lines were deeper, less weathered. These were made recently, within the last year, I'd guess. Breslin, Ramirez said immediately. He was stationed here 8 months ago. He could have made these marks. Or something else could have, Boaz said darkly. Something that knew we'd come back looking for answers. They moved through the throat slowly, documenting everything while maintaining constant radio checks with each other despite being within visual range. The confined space made everyone nervous. Hundreds of feet of stone hanging overhead. The walls so close they could touch both sides at once in some sections. Enoch remembered how the passage had seemed to shift during his first visit, how the distance had stretched and compressed in impossible ways. But today it remained stable, just a narrow corridor through solid rock that opened eventually into the wider valley beyond. The amphitheater looked different in daylight, less threatening, more like a natural geological formation that happened to have good acoustics. The bell house stood in the center, exactly where Enoch remembered it. But in the bright morning sun, it looked less like something supernatural and more like an abandoned structure that someone had decorated oddly. The bells hung motionless in the still air, and the clothing items draped over them could have been trash left by squatters rather than offerings to something unknowable. "That's it," Enoch said, pointing. "That's where I found Breslin's jacket." They approached cautiously, spreading out slightly to view the structure from different angles while still maintaining line of sight with each other. Laura Lee started photographing immediately, documenting the bells, the clothing, the markings that covered every surface. Ramirez circled the perimeter, looking for tracks or other evidence of recent human presence. And Boaz stood at the entrance to the amphitheater, staring back the way they'd come with an expression that suggested he was seeing something the others couldn't. "This is wrong," Boaz said quietly. "The approach was too easy. Last time I came looking for this place, the canyons fought me every step of the way. Paths that should have been there weren't. Directions got turned around. Landmarks moved. But today we walked straight here like it wanted us to find it." "Maybe the conditions are different," Ramirez suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Different time of day, different weather patterns affecting the acoustics. Or maybe it doesn't need to hide anymore," Enoch said. He was standing near the bell house now, close enough to read the name tapes on some of the uniform items. Besides Breslin's jacket, he could see at least 4 other names, agents who'd disappeared over the years in this sector. The oldest item was so faded he could barely read it, but the date stitched into the fabric suggested it was from the 1980s. All these people. How many others are there that we don't know about? Laura Lee had moved to examine the markings on the bell house walls, tracing the lines with her fingers without actually touching them. "These aren't random," she said. "They're organized, almost like a filing system. See how they're grouped? Each cluster seems to correspond to a different time period, a different set of incidents, and they all converge here at this central point." She indicated a spot on the main wall where the lines came together in a dense knot of symbols. "This is the anchor, the focal point for whatever's happening in these canyons." "Can you translate any of it?" Ramirez asked. "Some of it. It's not Morse code exactly, but it uses similar principles, combinations of marks representing sounds or concepts." Laura Lee pulled out a notebook and began copying down symbols, working through them methodically. After several minutes, she looked up. her face pale. It's a record, a log of everyone who's been taken by the canyons. Names, dates, locations, and instructions for how to find them. Instructions. Enoch felt his pulse quicken. You mean they're still here? Breslin and the others are still somewhere in these canyons. Not in the canyons as we understand them. The markings refer to something called the line of sight. It's described as a place between perception and reality, where echoes become solid and sounds take physical form. People who cross the line of sight don't die. They get trapped in this other space, this echo dimension, and they can't find their way back because the paths only exist in specific conditions. What conditions? Ramirez demanded. When the canyons remember, when the acoustics align in certain ways and the echoes from the past become strong enough to interact with the present. Laura Lee looked at the bell house, at all those bells hanging silent in the still air. The bells are markers. They're placed at points where the line of sight is thinnest, where people can accidentally cross over if they're not careful. And once you cross, the only way back is if someone on this side calls to you, creates a strong enough sound to pierce through and guide you home. So we could get them back, Enoch said. If we call to them, if we create the right kind of signal, we could bring Breslin and the others back across the line. Or we could cross over ourselves, Boaz warned. Sound works both ways. If we create a signal strong enough to reach them, we also create a doorway strong enough for us to fall through. And based on these markings, once you're on the other side, time doesn't work the same way. You could spend years there while only hours pass here. Or vice versa. They stood in silence for a moment, digesting this information. The sun had climbed higher, but the amphitheater remained in shadow, the canyon walls blocking most of the direct light. Enoch looked at the bells, at the uniform items hanging like shrouds, and made a decision that he knew was probably foolish but felt necessary anyway. We have to try, he said. We have to at least attempt to signal them. If there's any chance we can bring them back, we owe it to them to try. And if we end up trapped over there with them? Ramirez asked. Then at least we'll know what happened. At least there will be a record, a warning for whoever comes after us. Enoch pulled the small bell from his pocket, the one that had appeared on his dashboard. These bells appeared for a reason. They're not just markers, they're tools, ways to communicate across the line of sight. Laura Lee was nodding slowly. The markings mention sympathetic resonance, the idea that bells ring in response to each other, even at a distance. If we ring these bells here, and if the agents on the other side have bells with them, the sound should create a connection, a temporary bridge across the line. Then let's do it, Enoch said. He reached for one of the bells hanging from the bell house, and the moment his fingers touched the cold metal, everything changed. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, not just from the bell he'd touched, but from all of them simultaneously, as if his action had triggered every bell in the structure at once. The noise echoed off the canyon walls and came back multiplied, layer upon layer of ringing that seemed to have no source and no end. And underneath the bells, Enoch could hear voices. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all calling out at once in a chaos of sound that resolved gradually into distinct words. Help us. Lost the line. Can't find the way back. Still here, still here, still here. The amphitheater began to shift. The walls seemed to pull away and close in at the same time, distance becoming meaningless as space itself warped around them. Enoch tried to step back from the bell house but found his feet wouldn't move, rooted to ground that no longer felt solid. He looked for the others and saw them frozen as well, Ramirez with his hand on his radio, Laura Lee still holding her notebook, Boaz reaching for his own belt bell. Then figures began to appear. They emerged from the canyon walls themselves, stepping through solid stone as if it were water. translucent at first, barely visible, but growing more substantial with each passing second. Men and women in various states of dress, some wearing modern Border Patrol uniforms, others in clothing from different eras. Enoch recognized Breslin immediately, his partner standing maybe 20 feet away, looking exactly as he had the last time anyone had seen him except for his eyes. Those were wrong, too large and too reflective, seeing things that shouldn't be visible. "You rang the bells," Breslin said, his voice carrying that same hollow quality Enoch had heard during their first encounter. "You called across the line. Now you're halfway over yourself. Stuck between here and there, visible to both sides but belonging to neither." "We came to find you," Enoch managed to say, though speaking felt like pushing words through water. "To bring you back." "Back to where?" Breslin smiled, and the expression was sad and knowing. "I've been on the other side for 8 months, but in the echo dimension, I've walked for 8 years. I've seen things that exist only in reflected sound, talked to people who drowned in their own voices, learned to navigate paths that only appear when certain frequencies align. I'm not the same person I was, none of us are. We've become part of the canyons now, part of the ecosystem." More figures were appearing, filling the amphitheater until Enoch couldn't count them all. Some looked recent, maintaining mostly human features. Others had deteriorated, become more sound than substance, their forms wavering and shifting with every echo. And standing among them, Enoch saw his own silhouette from the photo, the shape that had been waiting at the bell house before he'd even arrived. It turned to look at him, and he realized it wasn't a prediction or a warning. It was a shadow, a potential future, showing him what he would become if he crossed the line completely. "The bells create doorways," Breslin continued, "but they don't discriminate. Ring them long enough, loud enough, and anyone nearby can cross over. You wanted to rescue us, but all you've done is open the path for yourselves. The canyons are hungry, always hungry, and you've just offered yourselves as food." The bells were still ringing, that endless cacophony that made it impossible to think clearly. Enoch tried to move again and found he could, but the ground beneath his feet felt wrong, too soft and too hard at the same time. He looked around for the others and saw them struggling with the same disorientation. Ramirez had his radio out, was shouting into it, but no sound came from his mouth that Enoch could hear over the bells. Lauralee was writing furiously in her notebook, documenting everything even as reality unraveled around her. And Boaz was standing perfectly still, his hand on his bell, his eyes closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then Boaz opened his eyes and rang his bell. Just once, a clear, sharp sound that cut through the chaos of all the other bells. The effect was immediate. The translucent figures froze in place, even Breslin stopping mid-gesture. The overwhelming noise from the bell house diminished slightly, enough that Enoch could hear Boaz speaking. "Counter-resonance," Boaz said calmly. "Sound cancels sound if the frequencies align properly. I learned that the first time I was here, the thing that let me escape. You don't fight the echo dimension with silence. You fight it with controlled sound." He rang his bell again, and more of the figures faded, becoming less substantial. "Everyone, use your bells. Match my pattern. 3 short rings, 2 long, 3 short. It's an old signal, a call used by cattlemen to find each other in the dark. If we create it together, we can establish our own line of sight back to our side." Enoch pulled out his bell and followed Boaz's pattern. 3 short rings, clear and deliberate. 2 long rings, letting the sound carry. 3 more short rings to complete the sequence. Ramirez and Lauralee joined in, their bells adding to the pattern, and slowly the chaos began to recede. The translucent figures grew dimmer, the canyon walls stopped shifting, and the ground solidified beneath their feet. But as the echo dimension released its grip, Enoch saw Breslin's face change. The hollow quality in his eyes sharpened, became angry, and he lunged forward with speed that shouldn't be possible. His hands, cold and solid despite their translucence, grabbed Enoch's shoulders. "Don't leave us here," Breslin said, his voice breaking into something raw and desperate. "Don't abandon us to the echoes. We've been lost for so long, and you're the first people who could hear us, who could see us. Please don't leave us alone." Enoch wanted to help, wanted to pull Breslin back across the line with them, but he could feel the wrongness in his former colleague's touch. Breslin wasn't fully human anymore. He'd been changed by his time in the echo dimension, reshaped by it until he was more sound than flesh. Bringing him back wouldn't be a rescue. It would be forcing something that no longer belonged in this world to inhabit a body that couldn't contain it anymore. "I'm sorry," Enoch said, and meant it with everything he had. "I'm so sorry." He rang his bell again, matching Boaz's pattern, and Breslin's hands lost their grip, becoming insubstantial. The figure that had been his partner stared at him with those two large eyes, and then he was gone, dissolved back into the canyon walls along with all the other figures. The bell house stood silent once more, its bells motionless, and the four living people found themselves standing in an amphitheater that suddenly felt very empty. "We need to leave," Boaz said. "Now, before the canyons decide to try again." They didn't argue. They moved quickly back through the throat, no one speaking, everyone keeping their bells ready in case the echo dimension tried to pull them back. The markings on the canyon walls seemed darker now, more prominent, as if feeding on what had almost happened. When they finally emerged from the canyon and reached their vehicles, the sun was still high overhead. Less than 2 hours had passed since they'd entered, though it had felt like much longer. They drove back to the station in silence, each person processing what they'd experienced in their own way. When they finally gathered in the conference room to debrief, Ramirez looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "We're closing that section," he said. "Permanently. I'm recommending the entire Northern Canyon line be designated as off-limits to Border Patrol operations. We'll reroute patrols around it, install sensors at the periphery, but no one goes in there again." "And the missing agents?" Enoch asked, though he already knew the answer. "What do we tell their families?" "The truth, as much as we can give them. That they're lost in terrain we can't safely navigate, and that recovery isn't possible." Ramirez's voice was heavy with the weight of that decision. "It's not the answer anyone wants, but it's the only one we have." Laura Lee spoke up quietly. "I'll work with the Park Service to restrict access from our side as well. We can claim environmental hazards, unstable terrain, whatever excuse will keep people away. But we should also document everything we found, create a record that future researchers can use if they ever develop technology or understanding that lets them investigate more safely." "And if they don't?" Enoch asked. "If this just becomes another legend, another story that gets forgotten over time, then at least we tried," Boaz said. "At least we know what's there and why we can't go back. That's more than most people who've encountered the echo dimension can say. Most of them are still lost in it, still calling out, still hoping someone will hear and come find them." The meeting broke up shortly after, everyone exhausted and traumatized in ways that would take years to fully process. Enoch drove home as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of red and purple. He thought about Breslin, about all the others trapped in the echo dimension, and he wondered if they dreamed when they rested, if they could still remember what it felt like to be fully human, fully real, or if those memories had been eroded away by the endless echoes. When he got home, he found his bell sitting on his kitchen table even though he was certain he'd left it in his truck. It sat there innocently, just a piece of tarnished metal, but he knew now what it really was: a marker, a reminder, a connection to a place he'd glimpsed and barely escaped from. He should throw it away, get rid of it. But something stopped him just like it had before. The bell was evidence that it had all been real, that he'd stood on the line of sight between this world and the echo dimension, that he'd heard the voices of the lost and chosen to save himself rather than join them. He didn't know if that made him a coward or a survivor, but he knew he'd carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. 3 weeks later, Enoch requested a transfer out of Big Bend. It was approved immediately, his supervisors probably relieved to move him away from the canyons and the memories they contained. On his last day, he drove past the observation point one final time. The northern canyon route was officially closed now, warning signs posted at every access point. But as he looked out across the landscape toward where the bell house stood hidden in its amphitheater, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A smoke rising from deep in the canyons. Not wildfire smoke, but something more controlled, more deliberate. And carried on the wind, barely audible, was the sound of bells ringing. Not in chaos like before, but in pattern. 3 short rings, 2 long, 3 short. The same signal Boaz had used to navigate back across the line of sight. Someone was in the canyons, someone was ringing bells, and whether they were trying to escape the echo dimension or calling others to join them there, Enoch couldn't say. He thought about reporting it, about turning around and investigating, but he kept driving instead. He'd made his escape, paid his price, and he wasn't going to risk crossing that line again. But sometimes, late at night when the desert was silent and still, he'd wake to the sound of bells. Not from outside his window this time, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that existed in reflected sound and trapped echoes. And he'd wonder if part of him had stayed behind in those canyons, if leaving hadn't been as complete as he'd thought, if the echo dimension held on to everyone who touched it, keeping pieces of them trapped in that space between perception and reality. The bell on his table would ring sometimes, moved by vibrations that shouldn't affect it or responding to sounds only it could hear. And Enoch would listen, trying to decode what it was telling him, trying to understand the language of echoes and lost voices. He never figured it out. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe some translations weren't meant to be heard by people who still lived fully in the real world. But the canyons remembered. The canyons always remembered. And somewhere in the darkness between sound and silence, Breslin and the others walked their endless paths, still calling out, still hoping that someone would hear them and have the courage to answer. Still waiting for the bells to ring in just the right pattern, at just the right frequency, to finally bring them home. The line of sight remained unbroken. The echo dimension remained active, and the bell house stood in its amphitheater, collecting uniforms and marking time, patient and eternal as the canyons themselves. A monument to everyone the desert had claimed, and a warning to everyone who thought they could navigate its depths without becoming part of its endless echoes. Enoch Calder lived with that knowledge for the rest of his days. Sometimes it was a burden, heavy with guilt and loss. Other times it was a gift, a reminder that he'd survived something that consumed so many others. But always, always, it was accompanied by the sound of bells ringing in the distance, marking the line between this world and the other, calling to anyone foolish or brave enough to listen. And in the canyons of Big Bend, where the limestone walls held echoes from 100 years, and the air carried sounds that had no source, the bells continued their vigil, waiting for the next person to cross the line, waiting to add another uniform to their collection, waiting, as they always had and always would, for the canyon to claim what it considered its own.